Chairman Kane, we have Bill Amaru, Khalil Bogdan, Lou Williams, Mike Pearnock, Shelley Edmondson, and Sophie Sawyer in attendance. We are missing Bill Doyle and Tim Brady at this time. I'll let you know if they log on.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We've got it's not a new protocol, but we're approaching these meetings, so we have to do a roll call on attendees and when it comes to minutes and the agenda. So just bear with me here. That's all I have. And I'll move on to the review and approval of the January 21st, 2022 draft business meeting minutes. Any changes to be made?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have a change. Khalil.
Yeah, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Page 6. We need to add a word because it changes the whole meaning of the statement. Last MFAC meeting when we were having when Dan removed the rulemaking he was going to have. At that time, I said if you go down to the second paragraph from the bottom, and it says Khalil Bogdan also expressed concerns over DMF retaining discretion and flexibility. That should read, but after DMF, it should say not. It said Khalil Bogdan also expresses concern over DMF not retaining discretion and flexibility. That's when I had said that if in fact that rulemaking what did go into effect, DMF would not have the discretion to be able to extend the squid fishery on. So that statement I made might have been interpreted before the minutes. So that should read Khalil Bogdan also expressed concerns over DMF not retaining discretion and flexibility.
Thank you, Khalil. I'll make that typographical error.
Thank you so much.
Will change.
So I'm going to intercede here. There were no changes in this agenda, so we can move on to what Khalil just discussed. And now we're going to have to do a roll call vote on this, Jared.
If there are no more changes to the minutes, we can proceed to a motion and a roll call vote. Mr. Chair, I'd also like to say that Bill Doyle and Tim Brady have arrived.
Thank you. So we need a motion for that change, Khalil.
So are there any more amendments? I'm not seeing any amendments. Then it would be a motion to accept the minutes as amended.
And we need to second.
Suki, motion to approve the minutes.
Thank you, Suki.
Shelley, second.
Thank you, Shelley. All those, anybody opposed?
No,
Well,
we didn't roll call, Ray.
We have to do roll call. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Khalil,
You want me to call the roll?
I can call it from here. Khalil,
Yes.
Suki, you made the
Yes.
motion. Bill Doyle,
Yes.
Lou Williams,
Yes.
Shelley Edmondson,
Yes.
Tim Brady,
Yes.
Bill Amaru,
Yes.
Mike Pearnock.
Yes.
Motion unanimously approved. Okay, so we've got the agenda and we reviewed the previous meeting's minutes. I'll be making some comments under other business. Other than that, I'm going to turn this over. Once again, I appreciate the attendance of our commission members. And I'm going to turn this over to Commissioner Ron Amidon.
Thank you, Chairman King. And thank you to all of the commission members for, again, putting in the time and the quality of work that you folks do. I want you to know that I have done as much as I can do to make sure that everyone above me, both in EEA and in the governor's administration, know the level of expertise that you folks have and the level of professionalism that you conduct at all times. And I have continued to recommend the reinstatement of you folks. I think the work that you do is exemplary, and you truly lead by example. I'm happy to say that reinstatements have been coming through. We've had 3 come through in the past couple of weeks, and I hope that by the end of this month, we'll have all of the reinstatements complete and behind us. So thank you for paying attention to the details and getting all of the background checks filled out and sent in. That's important to keep that effort moving forward. And I see we have Lieutenant Matt Bass on with us today, and I want to let him know that I was at a Ducks Unlimited meeting banquet recently, and there were lots of stories around the room going on about the professionalism by the environmental police down in Chatham with the rescue of 4 hunters that lost their boat and all of their gear and all their firearms. There was lots of stories about how I believe everything except 1 firearm was recovered. And so decoys, layout boats, everything was recovered other than that 1 firearm. So that's a great job by you folks. And I want to thank you for setting the standard that you folks do within the environmental police. And Chairman, that'll conclude my comments. Thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you, Commissioner. Any questions for the Commissioner?
I'm not seeing any hands raised, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jared. We'll move on to law enforcement. Lieutenant Bass, you have the floor.
Good morning. I believe, yeah, Captain Clayton might handle this, but thank you, Commissioner. That was, I appreciate those, the positive feedback.
Good morning, Captain Clayton's on, and we appreciate the comments, Commissioner, and fortunately, we didn't lose any lives in that issue. Essentially, what we've got are 2 things that I want to bring to your attention, and the first one is that we've got ongoing whale protection underway for the past month or so, and I'll let the lieutenant speak to that in a minute, but I also wanted to add that in the coming months, you may see a promotion of sorts, because they've posted internally 2 positions, chiefs of enforcement, 1 inland and 1 coastal. So hopefully those applications close today. So hopefully in the coming weeks, you'll have some information from Lieutenant Colonel Moran or the director as to who may be ascending to those roles. And with that, I'll please leave Lieutenant Bass to provide any details of the whale protections that we've been doing with regard to speed and interdictions out there and gear recoveries. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Captain. Yes, so for the last we did get an early start on some of our gear removal projects with our new recreational closure. Allowed us to get out starting, November, December, January. We've, if you don't know, DMF has contracted several boats to have a kind of a coordinated effort to remove gear, the backside of the Cape, Provincetown area, Boston, and north and south of Gloucester, with us having the Jesse in Sandwich kind of in charge of Cape Cod Bay. So looking at the results, I think the people in Cape Cod Bay have got probably a 10-year head start on the learning curve on how important to get your gear compliant and out of the water. So we've probably just our recovery efforts have gotten mostly lost in storm damage here. Moving further north, for whatever reason, we seem to be getting less compliance. If I don't know if they're just not believers yet. And also maybe a stark difference in Cape Cod Bay, we're seeing a vast majority of compliance with the weak links and also weak rope, inline contrivances. And in some cases up north, not so much. So those kind of investigations are still ongoing, but I think it's been a great coordinated effort with these contractors as well as a DMF, getting gear, documenting all this, and it's been a pretty efficient process, I think. So with that, I have nothing else. I take any questions if there are.
Questions for Lieutenant Bass or Captain Clayton?
Not seeing any hands raised, Mr. Chair.
The Director Dan McKiernan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ray. I'll be very brief because I know we have a lot of business. I just want to bring attention to the commission, an item that is in the materials, but we're not debating or discussing at length today. And that is a petition from the Massachusetts Conch Association asking us to amend the schedule of gauge increases. Currently, the gauge is increased or is scheduled to increase every other year through 2029. And at that time, when we're done, we will approximate the 50% size at maturity for those whelks that just meet the gauge. In other words, of all those whelks that are very close, half of those would be sexually mature and half would not. And we enacted this just about 4 years ago. They are requesting this change. My intent is to have the staff review the status of the fishery and come back and give me information. I'll come back with a recommendation to you at the May or June meeting. I do note that the underlying rationale of the petition is to allow time for additional research and stronger science-based decision-making. In my view, the gauge increases was science-based, and it was the product of 2 irrefutable age and growth studies that was a product of DMF. And the schedule that was enacted at the time was enacted under Director David Pierce. And I just want to give the commission some insights that David thought that the program was inadequate because we were stretching out the conservation over 10 years. And in his estimation, he looked at that problem of very few mature females or mature animals being protected. And he thought that the regulations as proposed was inadequate, but I assured him that it was the right thing to do because we would spread the pain over a decade and it would be incremental. And I was convinced that the fleet would benefit from that. So we will be bringing something back to you folks at one of our summer meetings. I know that many of you may have gotten calls from some of the petitioners, but at this point it's in our possession and we're going to have staff dive into it and we will get back to you this summer with an analysis. So that's all I have under my announcements. I think it would be great to get right into the business meeting in terms of some of the other action items or the discussion of the emergency regs, given that some of the commission members may have time constraints. So I want to get through this material pronto.
That's all well and good, Dan. I have one question, Director. I was reading some documents the other day. I believe it's Rhode Island and Connecticut. Maybe somebody who knows something about Conch can address this. I believe their measurement is 4.5 inches. How does that stack up against the way we measure?
Well, that's a good question. You know, there isn't an interstate management plan for this species, and that's because they do not migrate across jurisdictions for the most part. So each state has kind of created its own management scheme, which is probably appropriate given the closed nature of these populations. So offhand, I don't know exactly how those other 2 states are measuring Conch. I do know that Rhode Island, I believe, has a total length. So some states go with total length. Others go, you know, from the top of the siphon. I'm sorry, the bottom of the siphon to the apex of the shell. One of the problems with that is it wouldn't, you know, you have a problem if the shell breaks. An animal that you captured and put into the tote as legal, if it broke, would become illegal. Others have kind of gone their own way in terms of the gauge design and the utilization of a gauge. But at the end of the day, it's important to match your regulations to some conservation standards or some conservation strategy. And so you know, there is a report coming out. The Sea Grant down at in Virginia worked with us, and there is a report coming out. I will be able to get it to the commission for the April meeting because I believe it's finally been completed. That does compare and contrast different states' rules. But the challenge you have there is that as you go further west and south, you probably have different size at maturity values. The animals would grow differently based on temperature. And obviously you go west and south and the temperatures are going to be warmer. So Ray, I will provide that to the commission, in advance of even our summertime or late spring review of that petition. I'll get it to you as soon as we receive it.
Thank you, Director. I have one more question. It's directed towards another commission member. Shelley Edmondson, I believe this year you were funded, you and two other colleagues were funded on a Conch sex ratio study. Has that been implemented? Are you looking at that now? Have you begun work on that?
Hi, Ray. So the grant is with the Commercial Fisheries Research Foundation, and it's to create a whelk research fleet. So using at-sea tablets to collect fishery-dependent data. So this year, this season, it will be implemented. Work has begun on collecting information from the fishermen that we're partnering with, and the tablet will be tested this season. So this is a way to collect data using, fishermen support and help. It's not looking at sex proportions. So it's a tool that can be used going forward to understand size ratios being harvested. There's a variety of data that the tablet can collect, but it's not looking at sex ratios. You have to dissect the whelks for that.
Very good. Thank you very much, Shelley, as long as we're moving forward with that grant research.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Hey, Ray, I think
Yes.
Bob Glenn is on the call and he has some information on the Rhode Island minimum size. Bob, can you speak to that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Dan. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, just quickly, Ray, right now, Rhode Island has a smaller minimum legal size than Massachusetts. They also measure differently. They have a standard whereby you can measure height and or length. As Dan mentioned, length is problematic. We've moved away from that because the siphons break off in the totes, and a whelk that was legal when you put it in the tote can very easily be sublegal because the siphon breaks off. So we've gone to a different standard. I'll also just mention that given that Rhode Island is a warmer environment and they have their reproductive schedule is faster than ours, they mature at a smaller size than ours, it would be appropriate for them to have a slightly smaller minimum size to matching it to the biology of their local whelk population. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Any other questions on this issue before we move on to emergency regulations? Jared?
One question.
Shelley, you recognize.
Sorry, the phone's ringing at the same time. I just had a question. I had heard that there was some whelk research going on at SMAST. And I was curious about if anyone on the DMF staff knew about that.
I could take this, Dan, if you'd like me to.
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
So the Massachusetts Conch Association had reached out to SMAS with support from State Representative Cabral to undertake some additional whelk life history studies. They are currently doing kind of a pilot effort at this point, doing a similar maturity study to the one that DMF last conducted in 2016. They're at the request of the Mass Conch Association. SMAS has embarked on doing that study again, at least in a pilot phase at this point. I'm not certain at this point that they've obtained any secure funding to complete that study, but I am aware that they're interested. They also came up with a few additional studies, including one to use video camera technology to record kind of catch rates and size measurements electronically. And there were a few other possibility of initiating some type of a dredge survey. These were a few of the pilot ideas. At this point, I think they're only proceeding with the maturity study. But I'm not, as I said, I am not 100% positive at this point whether that's fully funded.
Great,
Yeah,
thank-
Bob, if I could follow up, just for the commission's edification. The challenge with this species is you can't tell its sex by looking at the shell or by looking at the animal alive. You have to dissect it. Not only can you not tell the sex, you can't tell the stage of maturity. So in order to establish the data set that we established through Steve Wilcox's work, you have to sacrifice a ton of animals and do a lot of pretty intensive dissections. And it's been very frustrating for me because many of the members of the industry are convinced that our data are somehow flawed, but we're confident in the data, and we know how much work it takes to reconduct a study like that. And so, everybody has to take a deep breath because it's a heavy lift to sacrifice and dissect all those animals to come up with those with the data set that allows you to estimate the size of maturity. So, we hope that their efforts are fruitful. But going back to your first question, Ray, about the sex ratio studies, that probably is something that's worthy of looking at through some kind of a modeling exercise. I know Shelley has expressed a concern about whether we're on a pathway to a predominantly female, harvest strategy, and I think that's certainly worthwhile looking at in the long run. But at this point, there isn't any project queued up to do just that. But we're working with the SMAS folks, and we'll keep everybody posted, especially if they get some funding to do this work.
Thank you, Director. Any other questions, Shelley, for the Director?
No, but I just would love to see some modeling on the sex ratio as the gauge size increases. I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, agreed.
Thank you. Well, let's move on to item 4. If there's no other questions on this Conch issue. Emergency regulations to set 2022 recreational fishing limits. And this is not an action item, right, Jared? This is just.
This is not, so the next 3 items, A, B, and C under 4 are all going to be filed under the Director's Emergency Authority, which means we will file regulations before we hold a public hearing and a commission vote. These will likely come back to the commission as final regulations at the June meeting. By that point, the seasons for these fisheries has started. Under these new rules, what we're looking for today is to kind of get some consent from the commission, feedback and consent from the commission, to kind of follow a more public process in reviewing these prior to filing them as emergencies.
Thank you, Jared. Well, let's move along here. Who's going to present? Nicola?
Yeah, Ray, let me start off. There's 3 items under this A, B, and C. There's Black Sea Bass, Summer Flounder, and Scup, and then under B, there's Gulf of Maine, Cod and Haddock, and the third is George's Bank. I just want to point out to the commission that B and C are New England Council measures for which we really don't have much discretion. It wouldn't make much sense to deviate from the measures that were already enacted by the New England Council. And we're coming to you to file an emergency action on those. It's kind of a pro forma vote. I couldn't imagine deviating from that. We'd have to have an enormous rationale to do so. The first one, which is sea bass, summer flounder, and scup, that is an ASMFC species co-managed by the Mid-Atlantic Council, and it's very much homegrown in terms of our rules are going to be different than the next state's rules, and every state within the range is going to have a slightly different set of rules. And so I apologize, or I regret that we go through this as often as we do, but it is what it is. The lateness of the analysis that don't come in until late January, early February, and the need to make these annual adjustments turn this regulatory process on its head. where in order to execute these rules in advance of the opening of the season, which is typically in May, we don't have enough time under state rulemaking or enough time on the calendar to really go through what is a normal rulemaking process of coming to you with proposals, going out to public hearing, getting good comment, coming back, getting a final vote. So today's discussion, as Jared mentioned, is I'm hoping that I get consensus from the commission, gives us a chance to rationalize to you all why we're intending to, or why we're proposing to do this. When I say propose, once I get buy-in from either all of the commission members or a strong majority, I know that when it comes up for final action, in the summer when we go to public hearing, then I'll continue to have the commission support. So, this is challenging. In order to do this, we had a scoping meeting, about 3 weeks ago or so. It was interesting. It was a Zoom call, and we used some of that feedback in our recommendations today. We've also spent a lot of time making phone calls to not only some of you as commission members, but to members of the public. And we've also gotten a lot of comments that have come in. So there's a lot of people are aware that we are in this sort of fast track process. And this is essentially the most public this is going to get between now and us enacting those rules. So it's important that we enact these rules well in advance of the season, because it takes a lot to get the word out on the street for the private anglers. And also we always hear from the for hire fleet that they want to know what the rules are, because it affects their bookings. It also affects their ability to sell trips. And so that's why, even though these rules may not be officially filed until sometime between now and the opening of the season, I intend to announce these rules after today's meeting so that everybody can know what's happening. And that includes folks at like the fishing shows. This weekend, there's a Rhode Island fishing show down in Providence that our staff are going to be attending, and they will be getting questions on this, and they'll have answers because of what we're going to do this morning. So up on the board are our emergency regulations that we are proposing, for this next upcoming season. I just want to thank staff for a really thorough memo that's been put together. We put this together as a team. It was it's a great piece of work. There's a lot of information in this, but it gets boiled down to these 3 species, summer flounder, black sea bass, and scup. And Nicola, I'm thinking it might make sense to discuss the black sea bass species first, only because even though in the sequence of the slides we do look at Fluke first, but I'm suggesting that maybe the black sea bass conversation happens first, because I'm proposing that we match the opening day for those 2 species, and that would mean the black sea bass is sort of the limiting factor. So our proposal, and we'll get into this in some detail, for the summer flounder is to simply reduce the size limit by a ½ inch and modify the season very slightly for black sea bass, where we have a 20% or so reduction required. Where we're proposing to kind of take a bite out of everybody's catch rates, which means an increase in the minimum size, and also go to a reduction from 5 to 4 and amend that season. And then for scup, it's a simple 1 inch minimum size increase, which has also been embraced by many of the states as well. So why don't we go to the next slide? Let's start with this one. So for those folks who attended our public scoping meeting, we did present a lot of information about what different amendments get you in terms of reduction. To achieve this 20.7% reduction that is mandated under the interstate plan, as well as by the Mid-Atlantic Council's action. We have options. We have the size limit, the bag limit, and the season. But the first thing the 3 states, the 4 or 5 states did, we got together and we all agreed to maintain a consistent size limit going from 15 to 16. And that helps with the assessment. It also helps with compliance when anglers might be fishing across state lines. Obviously, the season and bag might be different, but at least one rule would be the same, and that would be the minimum size. And we looked at many of these options, and a lot of these are described in the memo. But I know a lot of the party and charter boats would like us to have a maximum bag limit of maintaining at 5. Many of the party charter boats tend to focus on sea bass early, especially around the Cape and Buzzards Bay, and then they go off to other species. But if we did that, we would be denying other party charter boats to retain fish later in the season. And also we want to maintain uniform rules between the sectors, party charter as well as private. And that would be problematic as well if we lost the second half of the season. So this is a pretty good table that kind of allows you to see what you get with the different combinations. We've got season start date, we've got bag limits, and then we can also depict, well, what would happen if we change the bag limit, not only for the whole season, but manipulated the bag limits by wave, kind of like we do for tautog. And so you can see there's a lot of different options here. I do want to say we spoke to the environmental police, got their input, and they've urged us to have a consistent bag limit through the season, especially in light of the non-compliance challenges that they often encounter out on the water. These fish are super available in May and June, especially late May and into June. And so they urged us to keep the rules simple and try to maintain a constant bag through the season. So I was swayed by that. We all want more enforcement. We're all looking for better compliance. And I think by making the rules easier to understand and easier to enforce, you get better enforcement, you get better compliance. So by going to 4 fish from 5, not altering the wave by wave bag limits, we get a substantial savings between the size limit and the reduction in the bag limit. And all we have to do is cut off a little bit of the beginning of the season, a little bit of the end of the season. Personally, I'd love to see the fishery stay open during the September-October period. Every time I hear some of the Nantucketers speak on the issue, it kind of pains me that they have a later season out there in the eastern waters, and they're denied retention for a fair amount of time when fish is available to them. So I would love to see liberalizations, if we can get them in the future, to allow that fishery to stay open, for that fleet that would really like to see that. But in total, I think this is a good proposal. It tries to accommodate all the sectors, and in terms of the relative reductions that each sector would be taking, and that is our proposal for black sea bass. Nicola, do you want to fill in any gaps that I may have created in that presentation?
Maybe if there's particular questions about it,
okay,
that might be a more direct approach, but that sums it up.
Yeah, I think the memo was so comprehensive, but I don't want to read it verbatim, but there's a lot of information in that. So Ray, why don't we take questions and have discussion about our black sea bass options?
Very good. Thank you, Dan. Questions, Jared? Have you got hands raised?
Mike Beardenbach.
Michael, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dan, for your presentation. If you dig into the MRIP data, specifically for Massachusetts. And I'll give some examples where you look from May to June, and you look at the PSEs associated with that, many of which exceed 50% for 2021, going back to the past few years, which are then, as you know, are the basis behind the decisions to make what is caught by the shoreside angler, party boat angler, charter boat angler, and private rental boat angler. It was my understanding that the National Academy of Sciences indicated that PSEs over 50 would be thrown out. Yet when I look at this data that's publicly provided on the NOAA webpage with the MRIP data, it includes that data that exceeds 50%. My question is, if you normalize that, remove it and address it, does that change the outcome? Because I would suspect that it does, because it's a simple statistical issue. That's my first question. Thank you.
I'll respond to
Go
that,
ahead.
Dan.
Thanks, Nick. Yep.
So a couple things, Mike. You're right that moving forward within the next year or two, MRIP is going to stop posting those, wave mode estimates that have PSEs above 50 because they're not considered very reliable. And when we look at the MRIP data at such fine levels, you often do get those worrisome PSEs. So one thing to note is that the 20% reduction for sea bass, or 20.7%, is based on a coastwide estimate, and it includes 4 years worth of data. And when you pool those 4 years, the result is much lower PSEs. The technical committee also did a outlier analysis where they looked for anomalously high and low PSE harvest estimates at the state wave mode level and smooth those. So in particular, that 2021 wave 3 private rental estimate that you've pointed to was one of those estimates that was already smoothed down. And so that's how we got from an initial 28% reduction for sea bass to 20.7% because of the work that was done by the technical committee. And then when we work on the analyses, for our state specific reduction here, we're still using those 4 years worth of data, and that helps us with the PSEs becoming more under 30 when you look at the wave estimates pooled across 4 years. And breaking it down by mode, does result in, PSE problems. And that's one argument, against not looking at the mode specific regulations.
Nicola, could you explain what you mean by mode specific for the commission?
Yes, having separate regulations for the charter party fleet versus shore anglers and private vessel anglers.
So Mike, does that help?
Can I follow up, Mr. Chairman?
By all means, Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Nicola. Understand what you're saying. This is something that's not new to any one of us. This goes back to cod and many other species where we've been stating and indicating the same for many years now. When you look at the PSCs, you look at the data, the answer is to average it coast-wide, and then it makes that PSC get more normalized or within the range. But when you go state by state, it indicates the flaws. I would ask that in the future, we take a look at that, because if our PRCs are such that they're a detriment of the Massachusetts anglers, that we specifically look at what's going on in Massachusetts and see whether the adjustments are such so it's going to work consistent with the fact that we have so many black sea bass in our waters. And I mean, we're all not happy about the fact that we have a biomass that's 2 times what it's supposed to be, with tremendous number of fish, no lack of them, yet we continue to do the cuts. I'm disappointed too that, considered the dire straits of these cuts in relation to the fact that we have a great biomass, that more couldn't be done. And I know that's nothing to do with that at your end, because I give Nicola and Dan and your entire staff credit for all the work they've done with this the past 6 months, because it's been multiple decisions and quotas and changes and so on to get us to this point. Is that the pain here is not as bad as it could have been several months ago. But I would ask in the future that it's looked at, because the outcome could be different. As if you do some estimates of how many boats are really fishing during this period of time, it's just we did a quick estimate for 2021 and made some assumption, and there's 765 boats fishing every day for 43 days, and it does that surprise me that it comes out that way? No, because that's consistent with the way this has worked for many years now, but it's not consistent with what we see. So I hope that can be looked at and changed. I wish it could be done quicker, but I throw that out there. I'm not sure if that's the case. My other question or comment, if you look at New York, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, they have separate seasons and bag limits that change over time. And they have for some time now. And for instance, some of them have a shoreside bag limit, which, Dan and Nicola, I give you credit, and you and your staff for coming up with these options, because the 4 fish and the timeline is, I'd say it's about as fair as you can be for the shoreside recreational angler to the, charter for hire people, as well as private boater, with the exception the timing doesn't work for some because of the way the fish are and where they move later in the season. But why is it that in those states, they can have the separate seasons and bag limits and it works? And also it accommodates this question of a shoreside angler is going to get smaller fish as the season goes on, because with increased temperatures, the fish go into deeper waters, which if you're a wreck boat or for hire, you have the ability to go into deeper waters farther offshore to have access to them. So they accommodate that with a shoreside bag limit versus a bag limit that's different for others. It works in New York, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, yet, as well as other states, if you look at your table in the back. But there's a compliance issue here. Why is there not a compliance issue there? What's up with that?
So those separate shore rules pertain to the fluke fishery only, not black sea bass. And a couple states, I think it's Rhode Island and Connecticut, looked at those once their fluke minimum size limits got to 19 inches, 20 inches, very high. So I guess we're not saying that's not possible, but at the size limit that we have for sea bass, it may not be necessary to have that difference. So those other states with sea bass, they do have some wave specific bag limits, and we looked at a lot of those. I think some of the concern with that here was driven by compliance, and given their longer season, when they switched to that lower bag or higher bag, actually on September 1st, it's there for 4 months. It's not 1 week. Look at this, for example, if you did 4 fish, 2 fish, then you'd have 5 days with a different bag limit. And that just seemed like it would not have very good compliance for such a short period to be changing the bag.
Maybe I misinterpreted table A2. It shows Connecticut. Maybe that's party charter versus for hire, shoreside versus for hire for Connecticut. But those other states just show that there is a difference. I just am interested because we typically either see it on the Facebook page for the mass enforcement, or we hear at these meetings non-compliance issues, or those boats or individuals that have been found to be non-compliant. I thought that was just a few players, but I wasn't aware that there was such a non-compliance issue. And for those that are not complying, there's something being done about them, but what's being done about the others that are indicative of the fact that we're making a decision not to have variable bag limits.
Well, Ray, why don't we get input from some of the members of the environmental police on the call, and then we can speak to the table about the alternating bag limits going forward. But I think Mike's first question should probably be answered by the environmental police.
Yes, I was thinking the same thing. So who wants to take this, Lieutenant Bass or Kevin Clayton, Captain?
I can certainly take a stab at it as far as I understand it. So yeah, obviously the cases that we hear about in the commission meetings are notorious poachers that stay up at night figuring out a ways to get around this and do it consistently. Outside of that, you're not going to hear about all those cases where we give somebody $100 or a $200 ticket because they were over the limit once. So we do get, when those fish are in, we get a lot of boats, and you can probably find any number of violations. But for the big Mac Daddy ones, those are the ones we're hearing about here. And as far as I also like the simplicity or ease of understanding. Typically, if we cite somebody and they go to court, and just like I think Mike was saying, you're looking at Connecticut's regs, he sounded like he was having trouble figuring out what it means because all the different modes and dates. So having it consistent, I think, helps people understand and also helps our case in court. So when you can go to a magistrate or a judge and they can look at it and say, hey, that's what don't you understand? Does that make sense?
Michael?
Well, I appreciate the response, and maybe in the future we can see the statistics of what we're really talking about with the non-compliance, with how many licensed private saltwater anglers are on the water from a statistical standpoint, because there's always going to be non-compliance. As far as your comment, I didn't find it confusing. I looked at it and I see that each state that I mentioned has different seasons and bag limits. Because if I check the regulations every time I go, so I apologize if I erred and was unaware that it was not shoreside, but there is no doubt that Connecticut has different seasons and bag limits. Ultimately, we're trying to make this work for the shoreside angler to get smaller fish as the season goes on. That's what's available, because the bigger fish go offshore. And the for-hire fleet needs to make a living, and there's no lack of these fish. And I'm just trying to look for a mechanism to do that, and still can't understand why these other states don't have a compliance issue, yet there seems to be one here. Maybe that can be looked into to assess whether this is feasible in the future. Thank you.
Mike, I'd like to just draw on something Nicholas said that I think may have gone understated. And that's in the case of Massachusetts, we'd be looking, the options we modeled, we're looking at having a higher bag limit in wave 5 or wave 3 rather, to accommodate that spring fishery, and then dropping that bag limit down to something less in the summer and the fall. And that's different than what goes on in the other states, where they start with a lower bag limit and then go to a higher bag limit. And based on my conversations with Lieutenant Cullen and Lieutenant Colonel Moran, their concern is that drop in the bag limit in season is going to create more non-compliance, because the rules get tweaked downward. Whereas in other states that might not be as significant of a concern, because the bag limits are being tweaked upwards, and you're not dropping the bag limit in season. So, you go out on July 1 and you take 4 fish when it's a 2 fish bag limit. That's different than going out on July 1 and taking 2 fish when it's actually a 4 fish bag limit. So that might be one of the driving factors. And I know that that's one of the concerns here based on my conversations with law enforcement on the subject is it's that tweaking down of the limits, because that causes a lot of unintentional non-compliance.
Michael?
I have no more questions. Thank you for the response. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Other questions on black sea bass?
Khalil,
Khalil, you're recognized. Khalil, you're recognized.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Jared. This isn't particularly about sea bass, but about perceptions and listening to this conversation that just took place, the questions, the great questions that Mike Piardnock just asked, and then the answers, and Nicola and Jared and Dan. It just goes to show you how complicated this is. To the layman, to the person, it can be very complicated. I've learned over the past five and a half years serving on the Marine Fisheries Advisory Commission that, and it's just basically a statement I'm making, because the fisheries management can be very complicated. It's a very complicated process, and sometimes decisions need to be made that might not be agreeable to those involved, excuse me, with the particular fishery, whether it's scup, fluke, or black sea bass. And listening to this conversation, I can also understand how these decisions can be interpreted by the stakeholders involved regarding the particular fishery. There are a lot of questions. And I can relate to this. I know this personally, as I experienced it when I ran my own charter business on the North Shore. And there were times when I became very emotional over decisions made by the Division of Marine Fisheries. And even today, as a member of the Marine Fisheries Advisory Commission, I still become very emotional over certain issues. And I guess that's being human. And listening to this past few minutes, this conversations, people can just see how complicated things are. And however, since I've served on this commission, I guess I can say I've come to better understand how decisions are made, especially when it comes to rulemaking. And when tough decisions have to be made, especially when it affects the operation of a charter boat captain and his or her own business, I can honestly say that the decisions are not made in a capricious or arbitrary manner by Director McKinnon or the DMF staff. It's complicated. And these decisions are made, with the best available science obtained at the time. And the staff and the analysts at DMF use the science that is obtained to formulate a decision regarding marine fisheries management. It's tough. It really is complicated. And it's more complicated than people realize. Mike brought up some great questions. And he asked questions that I really didn't really understand. I mean, I'm not saying I didn't understand them, but and then maybe I didn't understand to ask him, but when listening to what Mike had to say, they were very logical. And comparing the different states, what we have in our state, what we're proposing for rulemaking, and what the other states are doing. And it's just, sometimes it gets confusing, and I just have to compliment. First of all, I have to compliment the people who put this memo together, regardless of whether it was for sea bass or fluke or scup. It's very comprehensive, and I just have to commend the staff for this. And I know I'm rambling on, but I think it's important that I say this, that decisions, I would like to have status quo. Wouldn't it be nice to have status quo the way it was? But I begin to realize that sometimes in fisheries management, you can't have status quo if in fact we're trying to follow the science. So one side of me, I rambled on saying that it's a complicated issue, and the other saying that I'm complimenting the staff. I'm not offering any suggestions, but I appreciated what Mike had to say, and And I guess I'm getting a little better picture of it, of what the issues are regarding the fisheries management. But I appreciate you allowing me to have this time to talk, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Khalil. Jared, any other hands?
Tim Brady.
Tim Brady, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Most of what I have to say is echoing Mike's frustration. Those of us that are operating a for-hire business, moving the start date to a season that, all these operators in Buzzards Bay, this is the high point of the entire season, is this early season black sea bass, porgy run that then starts to peter out. And I understand the enforcement of not wanting to lower a bag limit during the season, but that's just where we are and how the fishery works here. And it just continues to echo the need, if for-hire operators are expected to be licensed, to have safety equipment, to turn in fishing vessel trip reports, we need to have distinct regulations that this industry can give feedback to DMF of what we need and what works for us. And it certainly can be well within, whatever the regulations are, but it's very frustrating when we see, when the MRIP data doesn't reflect what we see on the water. We see a burgeoning population and even statistically, a growing sea bass population, a growing scup porgy population, and we're still getting cutbacks, and our season is getting chopped. And you just don't, they're not going to get these people back in the fall. They don't come in the fall for this. They come for the early spring fishery. So one thing, and I know we have a lot of constraints. We are not, making, we don't operate in a bubble here in Massachusetts. We operate with other states. But Mike's point is, if these other states can manage to separate out the bag limits and even, shoreside versus boat, and, for me particularly, I really think we need to find a way to use fishing vessel trip report data in the decision-making process. And what I mean is not just effort, but the actual species. And I understand there's uncertainty because there's not an observer there, and how accurate is it? But we need to drill down and get to where you're taking, managers want us to put this, the number of cod I catch, the number of sea bass I catch, the number of, and then tell me that they can't use that data because it's too uncertain, and yet make estimates from a dockside report from a patron of mine. It just makes no sense to me that that for hire and a recreational angler, who are really two completely different entities, are lumped in the same way. And this is a big hit here, moving that date from the 18th to the 21st. So my suggestion, at least, if I want to have one concrete suggestion out of my ramble here, would be we need to try to get at least a start date for next year nailed down earlier, so that people can book charters, because right now nobody's going to book a charter next year for May 18th. So if we move it to May 18th next year, you're going to lose out on some real prime potential fishing dates, because now everybody's going to be afraid, since it moved to the 21st, is it going to move further forward? So anyway, that's what I have to say. My fishery is totally different north of the Cape, but I hear from all the for-hire people that a lot of frustration on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Jared, hands?
Not seeing any further comments on black sea bass.
Okay, if you would pardon me, I would like to comment on this. Over the years, many years, we've had a number of federal buybacks for groundfish permits. And when the federal government has purchased these permits from individual fishermen, they also told them they like to see them move on, whether you go to computer school, truck driving school, or maritime school. And many of fishermen decided to go back to maritime school and get their captain's license, their 100-ton license. Now, they're not going to get a position on a tanker as a captain. A lot of them have moved into the charter fisheries. It's got to be recognized as a commercial fishery in the future. And I come to this point. We, in the state of Massachusetts, it's a huge commerce fishery for the state of Massachusetts. So we know all the numbers: hotels, restaurants, tackle shops, vessels, fuel companies. But we have to have more consideration, or ASMFC has got to have better consideration for the Massachusetts fishery. We really start the season. I mean, Virginia might get a fishery in February or March, but it's minuscule in comparison to Massachusetts. And for ASMFC, you know, they get their sixth wave numbers back to the sister states, like the middle of February. Then DMF has to turn around and come up with regulations for an impending season 3 months down the road. Now, these charter businesses have made reservations 6, 8, 9, up to a year out, you know, prior to the opening date. So I don't know, Nicola, maybe you and I can talk on a sidebar. We have new leadership at ASMFC, and maybe at the May meeting, I can approach Spud. And I brought this up before, this recommendation that wave 6 of last year be counted this year so that they can see actual numbers after wave 5, which would be the middle of December, because Massachusetts, we always get caught in the crosshairs on regulations, and we don't give the charter fleet enough time. We don't give anybody enough time, and that's not a lack of your work ethic and DMF's work ethic. It has to do with ASMFC and their turnaround. So I don't know if we can possibly move wave 6 into the prior, you know, like you'd be counting wave 6 of 21 through wave 5 of 22. So we get results by the middle of December as opposed to the middle of February. But this is definitely detrimental to commerce in the state of Massachusetts. And Dan and your staff, you're doing the best you can. This has got to go back to ASMFC. And I know we've gotten so far. We have 2 regions now, or actually 3: Jersey, the southern region, and the northern region. But they have to start looking at Massachusetts as a whole and what it means in the way of commerce to the state and the biomass that we fish on in this state. And that's all I have to say for now. So maybe Nicola, Dan, and I, we can talk about this before the May meeting in person in DC. Thank you much.
Sure.
Mr. Chair, you have Khalil and Nicola.
Well, we haven't heard from Nicola, so let's hear from Nicola.
I just wanted to respond, Ray, that I think your points and some that Mike also raised about the PSC is, you know, it's a good time maybe to talk a little bit about the harvest control rule approach, which there's going to be a public hearing next month for this. But the reason for that addendum is to get away from many of the problems that have been highlighted in this discussion about the management process right now: the unpredictability, the late notice, the uncertainty in the MREP harvest estimates. So those approaches that are being offered up for public comment next month would move us away from comparing the RHL to the point estimate of harvests and also incorporate the PSEs, or it would have predetermined measures that would be set for 2 years or 3 years. And so we would be moving away from the predictability. So those issues have certainly been recognized by the states. It's not just Massachusetts, all the other states are struggling with the same thing. And so we're trying to tackle that through the harvest control rule. But regarding the May 21st start that's being proposed, as you know, I did just want to note that, you know, starting on that Saturday in May, the third Saturday, is kind of a traditional approach for this fishery. And while the last 3 years we were status quo, which was kind of a temporary reprieve, while NOAA was willing to say, okay, you can have status quo rules, even though we know we're going to go over the harvest limit, you know, they didn't think they had that flexibility this year. But in prior years, we always were saying to the for-hire fleet, you know, be careful booking your trips. These rules are volatile, they're going to change. This is an every year type of process where we're trying to figure this out. So I recognize that some trips may already be booked, but that, you know, looking at the calendar this year, May 21st would line up more with what we have traditionally done for this fishery.
Thank you, Professor Meserve. Every time I listen to you, I feel like I've gone for a college educational course. Thank you very much. Khalil, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a comment, I have to agree with a little bit with what Tim Brady had to say regarding if I were a charter captain and I had 3 days cut off my starting time, because, you know, I'm fully booked a year in advance. That's a hardship. That even though it's only, people say, well, it's only 3 days, but it's 3 days of a season, and that makes a big difference. And also, I want to ask a question regarding at one time, and correct me if I'm wrong, and then maybe Director McCarron or Nicola can help out with it. The question is, let me make this a comment first, though. I understand that at one time we had black sea bass as a 20 bag limit for recreational, and correct me if I'm wrong, and then it went down to 10, then it went to 5, now it's going to 4. What would it take? And I know that the science is that you can't look at science in the future. What would it take? It seems like the bag limit is declining and declining and declining. Is there ever a time when things would be reversed and seasons would be elongated? That's the question.
Let me take a crack at that. So, Khalil, you recalled, or you've mentioned that we once had a 20 fish bag limit. Well, I was working for DMF back then, and I recall there was some level of discomfort going from 10 to 20, but one of the commission members, who was a for-hire operator, told us we needed to go to 20 so we can sell hope, and that nobody was really going to take up to that many fish, but that was an important selling feature, is to have really high bag limits. And so people looked at us back then, like, were kind of astounded that we had doubled our bag limits, and sort of questioned that. As far as the 10 to 5 to 4, I hear you. And, you know, what happened in the pandemic recently is, you know, everybody went out and bought a boat. And so it does worry me that the increased participation in the recreational fishery might mean we have perpetually lower limits than the historical norm. And then the question will be posed to you as a commission member and the rest of the commission, if we can liberalize in the future, how do you want to do it? Do you want to give Nantucket fish in September and October? No, do you want to extend that fishery at 4 fish and go and try to get some more time? And even within the for-hire sector, I know that there's a lot of boats that sell trips early in the season, and then they move on to other species, but there are other for-hire vessels that actually have, customers that would like to take a few fish, all summer long, late summer into the fall. And the interest of that for hire fleet, we learned back in the Diodati era, are not uniform. And in fact, Paul did a rather unique management action where at the urging of the for hire fleet, we created a special program for just those boats that wanted to go to this, to focus on the early season. And they would have this special set of rules, and it blew up the MREP program. And it was just too much for us to be able to manage, to have boutique rules of a subset of the charter boats and party boats to do something different than the rest of them. So I don't have an answer, but I one thing that hasn't been really talked about is what we're fishing on. We're fishing on a hyper aggregation of spawning fish that is very unique in the Northeast. So if you turn to the back of the memo and you look at our neighboring states, Rhode Island doesn't open until June 24th. New York doesn't open until June 23rd. I can't explain Connecticut. That's complicated, but those two states have very late openings, which tells you if they had the kind of fish that we have in our waters, they'd be pounding their state regulators to give them access to that fish, because the point is they don't have access to fish like that. And this migratory stock tends to come up into the Massachusetts territorial waters and are highly catchable. And so, we as fishery managers and as partners along the Northeast have to recognize that we have this fishery that has the potential to take a lot of fish. We moved our entire commercial quota away from this body of fish. It used to be we took 50 to 70% of our commercial quota during this wave 3, basically May and June. And we thought for the interest of the stock, let's go take those later. Plus, it was easier for us to manage the quota because the catch rates were so high. It was hard for us to forecast the closure dates. So I don't have a crystal ball. Nicola will probably have some visions as she works on this new addendum with ASMFC about sort of the future, management options. So I don't know, Nicola, would you like to comment on where you think there might be some liberalizations going forward? Can you see that far?
Oh, no, my crystal ball is not that clear. But, I think what Khalil points out that often when we have a very abundant stock, we see the regulations being tightened. And when we have a stock that's in worse shape and the catch rates are so low that you can end up liberalizing the regulations sometime, like that's the irony that exists in the management of these fisheries, and what we're trying, what's been recognized and we're trying to respond to now with a different approach that will instead look at what is the biomass, what is the fishing mortality, what has recruitment been in the last couple of years, which way is the biomass trending, before deciding that, just based on harvest alone, which way the regulations need to go.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, if I can add one thing, Dan, I know we've been thanked often enough at ASMFC on our conservation measures. As you mentioned, we moved the commercial fleet off the spawning biomass, but we also moved the recreational fishery off the spawning biomass, because that season used to start the 1st of May commercially, and we moved that, as you said, it opens now in July. And back then, when Paul Diodati was director and I was on the commission, you had hundreds of recreational boats out there. And, if you want to talk about PSEs and RHLs, we've done everything we can as a state to better the stock, the biomass, to the entire East Coast. And we've been thanked for that by individual states at ASMFC. But we need consideration. And, because of our conservation efforts in the past, by delaying the season for everybody, recreational and commercial. So Massachusetts needs some kind of consideration at ASMFC, and they can't just turn around and mandate something along with Garfo and give us 2 or 3 months to come up with a radical reform to the fishery, which this is. I agree with your tables, but still, it hurts a lot of people in this state. Thank you.
Okay, so Ray, to wrap this up, if we don't have any other commission hands,
Mike Pearnoff.
okay, go
is-
ahead, Mike.
Michael, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick follow-up. The biomass is 2 times as high, close to 2 times as high as it's supposed to be. And we're having a cut to the season in the bag limits. As I sit here, and I know fishery management in many instances defies logic, but if the biomass goes back to where it's supposed to be, and the effort continues because there's such a tremendous biomass, because unfortunately, that's the way the recreational fishery works. When there's a lot of fish, there's a lot more people fishing. Does that mean that we have impending further cuts that would occur if this catch continues? In my eyes, it does. The problem we have is MRIP. We're all trying to fix it. We've been trying to fix it for years. So we can separate the MRIP into recreational versus for hire. We request that the mechanism be put in place. Many of us participated in MRIP meetings last week up and down the coast, me including others, where the vast majority on the calls were the for hire fleet requesting and asking, please tell us what you need us to do. We will cooperate. We want to be part of the team. We want to be part of the lines of evidence in order to use our catch and release data and information where we catch them, when we catch them for fishery management purposes more than effort. That's somewhat beyond this discussion, but that has to happen. Then as far as the recreational MREP issues, I don't know what the answer is. It's a mess. The PSCs are all over the place. They're not consistent. We look at it and we don't have a good feeling about them because it doesn't pass the litmus test. You could implement a mandatory reporting on your phone app. Maybe that's the first step, but I don't see anything that's going to quickly occur to address that when it comes to the recreational end. As far as the for hire end, there's things that could be put in place to help us get to that point now. Then we could have an adequately reflected number of what percentage of, let's say, example, black sea bass we're catching, because if I recall properly, it's 3% of the black sea bass is being caught by the for hire party and six-pack fleet. If it's 3%, probably more like 6 if you take into consideration EVTRs and everybody reporting, including state vessels, which are not mandatory, and federal vessels. But if we're represented, or the for hire is represented with such a low percentage, that's where I don't understand why that's such a drop in the bucket that there wouldn't be separate seasons and bag limits. So I know that DMF is doing everything they can do to try to address this MREP behind the scenes, as well as publicly. But, we've been having this conversation for many years now, and I hope at some point this comes to fruition and it's addressed in a timely manner. Or I think we're faced with, I don't have a crystal ball either, but logic dictates that the biomass goes to where it's supposed to, the catch is the same, we're going to have further cuts and we're going to be scratching our head. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And Jared?
Yes, so Ray, on the board is my proposal for the September, the 4 fish limit, the 16-inch, the 1-inch size increase, and the season of May 21st to September 4th. And that's what I intend to enact as an emergency action. Is there anyone on the commission that wants to object to that and have me choose a different set of options that's on the board? Because this is kind of the range of options.
Uh, Well, I was reading through the notes last night and the emails Nicola received from a lot of the charter fleet, and they're all talking a 17-inch fish, which brings us to another dilemma, barotrauma. You know, it doesn't occur in our state waters because of the depth of fishermen are fishing. But I know years ago, 3 different universities did a study on it, and it was like a 60% mortality. So I can't object to your proposal, but reading the emails, and a lot of the charter fleet was saying, give us a 17-inch fish, but because of the concern of barotrauma throughout the range of the fish, I realize a 17-inch fish is too large. So I cannot object to your recommendation. That's myself.
Yeah. So I was just hoping to hear or to get some thumbs up from the group of commission members that that you would endorse me going forward with this, despite the warts, despite the, the overriding objections to the management scheme. I think this is the best option. Can I get the support of the commission to go forward with this?
So how do we want to do this, Jared?
I just think we take comments for those interested in providing comment. We don't need a formal vote on this. It's not an action item. So I see Mike Pearnock and Khalil.
All right, so you see hands raised, Jared?
I do. Mike Pearnock and Khalil both have their hands raised to provide
Okay,
the direct feedback on this option.
I'll recognize Mike Pearnock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dan. I support this measure. I think that it's the fairest that can be done for the shoreside angler, as well as the for-hire and the rec, with the constraints that we have as a result of the Magnuson-Stevens Act and the accountability measures we have to implement. We've had a discussion here, and we can have a further discussion offline of these other issues that hopefully can make this right or change it in the future. But I think this is the best we could do. Unfortunately, we all wish we could be fishing through October, and wish that the bag limit was maybe variable throughout the season, but this 4 fish per person per angler over that period is about the best we can do. So I'm on board. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Khalil?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with what Mike had to say. You heard what I said before about following the science. I feel that I would support this particular option over all the others that were the possible options that were presented to us. This one I think is the most liberal of all of them. I would rather have status quo. We all would rather have status quo. But I feel that, this is not an option. Director McKiernan's recommendation, I feel, is the best proposal that supports the science and the stakeholder at this time. I think some interesting questions were raised. And I think that the one question that Mike Pearnock raised was that if in fact the biomass does go down where it should be, supposedly where it should be, quote unquote, what's that going to bring up in the future? So this is a very fluid situation, but I feel that the 4 fish, the option that's being presented by Director McKiernan is the best option right now.
Thank you, Khalil. Any other comments, Jared? Any other hands raised?
I'm not seeing any other hands raised, Mr. Chair.
So therefore, we can
Okay.
move on. What do you want to discuss next?
I want to go to Fluke next,
Okay,
because the Fluke proposals is a little different. It's a liberalization, and we have an option to either increase the bag, modify the season, or reduce the size limit. Now, the best we can do on the reduced size limit is only 1/2 of an inch. If we went with a full inch, we would exceed the allowed liberalization which is, I believe, 16%, Nicola, the target liberalization.
16.5, yep.
16.5%. Well, it matches up nicely with 16.5 for the size limit. So anyway, the reason I want to bring this up second is I thought it would be logical to have those two opening dates be the same. Currently, the fluke season is opening on May 23rd. And so I thought for the sake of the recreational fishing community, it would make sense to not have two different opening days for two different species, but to make it the same. And the May 21st opening. As far as the the bag limit versus the size limit change, most of the comments we got in the scoping meeting was there was a lack of larger fish available to the recreational community, and they preferred to get access to slightly smaller fish, especially given that the commercial size limit is 14 inches. And we do have a set of commercial hook and line fishermen that, of course, are subject to different size limits. So the closer we can get those to the same, the better off we are. We spoke to law enforcement. They preferred us not to go with a 1/2 inch size reduction, but I think the sentiment was really quite strong among the anglers to try to get access to slightly smaller fish. And so I would ask for the indulgence of the environmental police on that one, in terms of whether we can make this message clear enough and get the compliance we want. But that would be my recommendation, is to go with that 1/2 inch size reduction and a different opening day, which would be the same opening day as what you just blessed me for with black sea bass. Nicola, fill in the gaps.
Well, just to say that the 16.5 inches is a little bit more than the allowed liberalization. So there is a short reduction in the tail end of the season. So we lose those days in October the 9 days in October that we currently have by going to 16.5. And in terms of the other states along the coast, most of them are also looking at size limit reductions for their liberalization.
So my question, Dan, is, so when you speak about the fleet that fishes Nantucket Sound and the waters east of Nantucket and even Provincetown, I know Provincetown, they always wanted a later fluke season, like in October, up off the race. So in both these actions, emergency actions, we're eliminating that fleet from black sea bass and fluke at 16.5 inches. 5 fish, May 21 to September 29.
I would ask Nicola, did we get much feedback from anyone looking for us to save October fluke fishing?
I tried to make a couple calls around, and some of the input that I heard was that, by the 3rd week of September or so. But that wasn't a census of all for hire captains, certainly. But I think this captures, most of the seasonal availability of fluke.
Yeah.
So what was the issue with enforcement, Dan? What did they say? Either go with a 17 or a 16 and not with a 16?
Yeah, they preferred us to use whole numbers. I could let Matt Bass or Kevin Clayton speak to that if you'd like.
Yeah, please. Let's hear from enforcement.
Yeah, this is Matt Bass. You might have to refresh my memory. I mean, I guess there's pros and cons to everything, but listening to this, I agree. I like that whole number, 16 inches. It makes sense to sync up the season with sea bass. I mean, 2 inches between commercial and rec is still a distance, but I like the idea of getting those closer together. We do get a lot of complaints of why can they do it and I can't. And so I'm struggling to remember what our objection would have been.
Well, Matt, it was a conversation we had with Jimmy Cohen and Pat Moran, and if they pointed out to us if they had a preferred option, it would be to go with the whole integer and not the fractions. But we were looking at these these 5 options. And in order for us to go all the way down to 16 inches, we would have to lose, a substantial amount of September fishing. And we are concerned about that. And we didn't want to lower the bag limit if, that would be another option for us. So, again, we're playing King Solomon here, splitting the baby. So our proposal is to go with just the 1/2 inch drop in size limit and manipulate the season length to A, match sea bass, and B, just to reduce the fishing, mostly in October. But we know from our summer flounder fishery, the commercial fishery, but once we get into October, the catch is typically not available to the inshore waters, and a lot of the fleet starts to move off. But so anyway, I guess I'm looking for any objections to this as a management strategy.
Mr. Chair, you have hands raised by Captain Clayton and Khalil.
Captain Clayton, please.
Hello again, thank you. I think I would suggest that from the years I've dealt with this particular topic, that any consistency that the commission can afford us as far as size, bag limit, as best we can across the jurisdictions if possible, would be beneficial to enforcement. That's all I have on that.
Thank you, Captain. Khalil?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a clarification, option 1. I might have missed something in the conversation and in the memo. Well, I like option 1. Now, why wouldn't we, with that? I mean, you have it as an option. Why wouldn't we use the option 1?
So option 1, Cleo, looks at the increasing the bag from 5 to 6 fish, and currently only about 10% of anglers are going home with 5 fish. So, that data doesn't suggest a great need for a higher bag limit, whereas 75–80% of fish are being released due to the minimum size, most likely. So that's where we wanted to focus this allowed liberalization, was on reducing the minimum size.
Okay, so if we go from 6 to 5 fish, then you're gonna have to help me out here, Nicola, because
So we're currently at 5 fish.
Why don't we just go 7? If that was an option, and you're saying that they possibly don't want the 6th fish, why don't we have a 17-inch minimum size for option 2 at 5 fish, and still keep it at October 24th?
So there could be an option. So we could leave the size and the bag as it is and just lengthen the season, but we didn't actually calculate that based on the thought that the season is sufficiently long. So we instead looked at bag and size changes rather than just lengthening the season with the current size and bag.
All right, and you have to excuse me, I'm being a little dense on this. So why don't we just have for option 2, a 17-inch fish ending at September 29th?
Because that would be reducing from where we currently are instead of liberalizing.
Oh, okay.
That would just be shortening the season.
And also, Nicola, isn't the thought by letting recreational harvesters take a smaller fish, you make up on the other end on mortality? When you pull up a 16.5-inch fish and the minimum size is 17, it's got to be thrown back overboard. So then you get into a mortality issue. Wasn't that also a thought in reducing the size? Because I know over the years we've heard from commission members that the inshore fishery doesn't really exist anymore unless we went to a smaller fish. That's why I'm
This
kind of
this would
pushing it.
hopefully reduce the release rate some and allow some, fish previously caught from 16.5 to 17 inches to be kept.
That's why I'm personally almost looking at option 5, because you have the same opening date as black sea bass. And you close it 10 days sooner than option 2. But as you stated earlier, when you call different members who fluke fish, or the public, whether it was head boats or charter boats or the public themselves, they said after the 3rd week of September, the fishery drops off, and that could be weather related. But that's why I'm kind of looking at option 5 right now. But that's, it will give the inshore fishermen better access to a smaller fish with a decent bag limit of 4 fish. And the season will start with black sea bass and end after the 3rd week of September. Did Tim Brady have his hand up?
Mike Beardnock does.
Michael, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to point out, I've been one that has indicated that for me and many others that fish Buzzards Bay and Vineyard Sound, as we've had increased water temperature over time, it's very difficult to catch fish over 17 inches. And I know for me, if I have 6 people on the boat, I go through one drift, they're all right around 14 and we have to release them. And, the comment made by enforcement about having consistent size limits, size limit for commercial, I believe, is 14 inches, 14.5 inches, and recreational is presently 17 with an alternative 16.5. So in our instance, we catch the fish, they're right around the commercial limit, and it's tough to get a 17-inch fish. I had it down to a science, every 20 to 30 was 17 inches. Now, if I was fortunate enough to transit 50 miles to Nantucket Shoals, between Chatham and Nantucket Shoals, they have no issue getting a 17+ inch fish. So my understanding is, or my assumption, and where many have come forward on board with 16.5, is that it helps the shoreside angler, as well as those that have difficulty catching a fish, 17+ inches. So as a result, I'd be on board with option 2.
And
Hey, Ray, this is
Yes,
Dan.
Ray. Yeah,
I see, I see Bob DeCosta's name is on the attendees list. And while this
Yeah,
isn't a
bring him
public
in.
hearing, we have
Bring him
kind of a
in.
unique situation here, and we're talking about late season fish availability. Would you consider
yes,
allowing him to speak?
yes. Bob
Okay.
DeCosta, you're recognized. Jared, you want to turn his mic on?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes,
Bob.
Bob.
Speaking from the charter fleet that fishes, east of Nantucket and to the south of Nantucket, option 2 is fine with us. Option 1 would be fine with us. Mainly, we need the full month of September. We do fish right up, and in the past have fished right up until Columbus Day. If we lose the first week of October, it would hurt us, but I think of the 2, option 1 or option 2 is the best for us. As Mike said, 17 inches is not a hard thing for us to find on the shoals. But I understand when you get into the sound and close to the shore that it becomes more difficult. I just wonder how much of a difference a ½ inch is going to make for that sound fishery or the inshore fishery. But option 4 and 5 really, they would drastically hurt not only the for-hire fleet, but the recreational fleet. There's a lot of charter boats or recreational boats that go out east of Nantucket and to the south in the fall. They're chasing false albacore out there, and they stop and catch some fluke. Now, they may not catch a whole limit, mainly because they don't want to clean that many fish. They just want a few for dinner, but they do go out there and fish quite a bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Any other hands, Jared?
Yes, we have Khalil and Captain Clayton.
Captain Clayton, please.
All right, thanks. I just want to make sure I was clear. When I was talking about consistency, I understand that there's going to be different rules for recreation versus commercial. But my point was simply that as best we can, I think it's helpful for enforcement to have consistent rules across commercial, across the jurisdictions, and for so that as best we can, if we can have commercial regs that are consistent across, I'll say between Rhode Island and Massachusetts, that'd be great. Same thing with recreational limits and sizes across the states. Not necessarily that commercial and recreation would mesh. We understand that. So I just thought that might help to explain that, if that's helpful. Thank you.
So I have a question for you, Captain Clayton. Rhode Island, their fluke fishery occurs when, and what's the size limit on the recreational?
I do not have that. I'd have to look it up or ask. Matt, do you know?
Sorry, no, I have no idea.
Well, Ray, I think the answer is in the back of the memo, but it's only last year's rules because unless Nicola has some inside information on what Rhode Island plans to do this year, it's all subject to change. But last year, Rhode Island had a 19-inch fish with a May 3rd to December 31st season.
Okay, so a half an inch, if it's a 19-inch minimum, they shouldn't have an interjurisdictional issue. I mean, if we're at 16 and a half and they're at 19.
It's Clayton again. We'll figure it out. That's not the issue, but I'm just urging that if consistency is possible, that I think would be helpful, because if we keep it simple for the stakeholders, the fishers, and for enforcement, I think that's a good thing for everybody. That's it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Captain Clayton. Khalil.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I erred before when I said, first of all, I support option 2. And I guess when I said to Nicola, why not 17 for option 2? What I meant to say, why not 16? What would that do? And keep it the same start and end date, September 29th, because understanding, you wanted to have most of that September time. What would, taking it to 16, what would that do to the percentage?
So 16 inches and 5 fish.
Yeah.
So that's what option 4 looks at. And so it requires a shortening of the season because the liberalization from going down a whole inch is something like 30%, and we're only allowed 16 and a half. So that's why the season then has to close on September 11th or 12th, depending on that start date.
That's incredible. Half inch would do that. Okay. But I meant to say 16 when I raised the question before, but I would support option 2.
Any other hands, Jared?
Not seeing any other hands.
Well, Dan, I guess you've got consensus. It's option 2.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And the last issue is SCUP. And this is fairly simple. It's a 1-inch minimum size increase. Nicola, would you provide some background on that?
Yes, certainly. So based on the comparison of the RHL, the recent harvest, something like a 56% reduction in harvest is required for SCUP this year. And the ASMFC and the Atlantic Council thought that was, excessive given the biomass level of SCUP, which is also 2 times its target level. But there's also an underage on the commercial fishery with SCUP to make up for some over harvest on the recreational side. So it's not as much of a conservation concern when the recreational harvest is above the RHL. So what the council and board agreed to was a coast-wide 1-inch size limit increase, which is projected to reduce harvest by about 33%, 31% in Massachusetts based on the size distribution of our harvested fish. So we really don't have an option here other than to go up in that size limit. However, the thing that I would note is that NOAA Fisheries, again, doesn't feel like they have that same discretion. And so they have warned that the states only doing this 1-inch size limit increase and not meeting that 56% reduction, they may propose more strict regulations for federal waters, even potentially closing federal waters to scup harvest. Here, only about 5% of our harvest comes from federal waters. I think that proportion is higher when you look at the for-hire sector, but the technical committee is looking to do that same outlier analysis for scup as it did for sea bass. So that may be one piece of information that we can try to persuade nymphs otherwise about taking more drastic measures, seeing as only 5% of the harvest is there, that them closing federal waters isn't really going to do much to reduce harvest on a coastwide basis. So but we're waiting on their proposed rule to see if that threat materializes in their proposed rule.
Okay, thanks, Nick. So, so that's the recommendation, Ray, is we have our fingers crossed that the outlier analysis would be done effectively by the TC, and we would only increase the or only restrict this fishery this year with a 1-inch minimum size change.
Hands, Jared.
Not seeing any hands, Mr. Chair.
Well then, Dan.
All right. Well, thank you, Commission. We will be announcing these rules, in the next few days, and I appreciate your patience and your indulgence in this very difficult rulemaking process that nobody's happy with. So we go on to the other two species, this Gulf of Maine cod and haddock and George's Bank cod. As I mentioned earlier, each of these is now complementary measures to the New England Council's action. It's different than what we just did, where each state is, because they have abundant in-state fisheries, are expected to come up with recipes for conservation. These are simply complementary measures. Jared, do you want to talk about the details, you and Melanie?
Yeah, I could just quickly run through what's changing. George's Bank cod we went over last month, so just as a reminder, the season will be changed to August 1 to April 30th. Bag limit being reduced from 10 to 5 fish, and a slot limit being implemented for 22 to 28. That applies to the entirety of the George's Bank. It's not managed at the sub areas like it is on the commercial fishery. This is in response to the status of the stock. On Gulf of Maine cod, the minimum size will be going up 1 inch, but there'll be a extended fall season. So the private mode will be open, or all modes will be open September 1 to October 7th and April 1 to April 14th with a 1 fish per angler per day bag limit. So that's that increases the season for both the for-hire sector and the private angler, giving the private angler, it looks like, 3 more weeks, and the for-hire angler another week. And then for haddock, the season and size limits stay the same, but the bag limit's going up 5 fish. So that's where we're at with that. If you have any questions on those, so this would match the proposed council regulations, and once the council approves these and they get approved by NOAA Fisheries, we will be moving forward to adopt them as emergency regulations.
So Jared, they've been approved by the council. They're just awaiting NIMS approval?
Yeah, no, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Questions for Jared?
Not seeing any hands, Mr. Chair.
We can move on. All right, we're on to number 5, consultation on residency issues regarding student lobster permits.
Right, okay.
Thank you, Ray. This is an interesting one. Embedded in the statutes for the licensing of commercial lobster fishing is the allowance for full-time students to obtain a permit to fish up to 25 traps, but with a narrow season of mid-June through mid-September. So it's clearly designed for as a summer activity. And I think historically, and even now, it's sort of a like an apprentice kind of program, something that you know, a lobsterman's son or a lobsterman's nephew or daughter or niece might participate in. And so it's been the only action we've taken on this on a regulatory side is we put a limit of 150 permits on this, you know, a cap on this recently. And this was done as part of our large whale take reduction plan or our, you know, activities specifically for the incidental take permit that we're applying for. We feel we have to ensure the National Marine Fisheries Service that this isn't a fishery that's going to, you know, grow at some unexpected rate and result in a whole lot of new buoy lines in the water. We don't think that's the case. When we looked at it historically, there's been about 100 or less permit holders every year. Over the last decade or so, we've had some challenges, and part of it was an interpretation of the statute where we were reading the statute in such a way that we were applying the residency requirement to this commercial permit. And the statute has some vagueness about it. And we were interpreting the statute traditional to how we deal with our commercial permits, that one would have to be a resident of Massachusetts in order to obtain this permit. It was brought to our attention that some of our permitting staff over the years may not have been fully cognizant of that. And furthermore, even on our application for the permit, there was a box you could check and pay a non-resident fee. So we were not clearly interpreting the statute in a consistent fashion. So our proposed regulation was to clarify to the public and in our permitting system that you need to be a Massachusetts resident to obtain this permit. At the public hearing, we were challenged in this interpretation. We had some good testimony from some individuals, including one person who was representing a student lobsterman who has a summer home in Massachusetts and in the past had received this permit and would like to continue to receive this permit. So while it was our intent to clarify the regulations to make it resident only, I think we got good feedback from a lot of stakeholders, including commercial lobstermen and others. And we feel pretty comfortable that we're going to interpret that statute differently than maybe the way we had over the last couple of years, and do so with a clear policy. So we want to create a policy where it states clearly that it will be allowed for a non-resident full-time student to obtain a student lobster permit. The one strange little nuance is as you read the statute and you tease it apart and you really study the syntax, what you wind up doing is you need to kind of come to grips with whether or not the permit that we're going to issue these folks would allow one to take not only lobsters, but edible crabs. So, you know, we can share the statute with you, but I just want to explain that we are going to put this policy out. We're going to explain that in order for us to read it this way, to accommodate non-residents, we're going to have to limit it to lobster only. which means, the edible crabs that they might take would be Jonah crabs primarily. And then I believe it would be in the best interest to clean up that statute, to clarify that, even get rid of some of the vagaries, and in fact, allow a student lobster permit holder to take a few crabs if they caught them. But for now, I think by taking this action, and it's not an action of the commission, it's not even an action by me, it's the creation of a DMF policy, and it's communicated to the public that yes, you can be a non-resident full-time student and participate in a commercial lobster fishery with that student permit. Like I said, I think I would like to see us improve that statute consistent with this policy and finish it there. So this one went to public hearing, and this is sort of the final action. The action is we are not coming to you to amend our regulations, that we're going to clarify the rule as proposed. I hope that's clear. Is there any questions?
Questions for the director? Any
Not
hands?
seeing any hands raised, Mr. Chair.
Well, Dan,
Suki?
Yeah, Dan, I just got a question. Thanks, Jared, Dre. Just got a question. How come there's no age limit on it?
That's a good question. I imagine if someone were in graduate school, they could do that. I don't see necessarily a need for an upper limit. I mean, and I would just say that full-time, it's a full-time classification. So the way we interpret that, you have to be, if you were in college, for example, you would have to be a full-time enrolled student, which means at least 12 credit hours. And so, it's not like you take a course that makes you a student. 12, full boat, at least 12 credit hours in a college is, that's a big deal in terms of commitment and cost. And that really does make you a student. So if your concern is that there might be somebody who might try to sort of, fake being a student with some small course load or a single course, we have rejected such applications in the past when they've come in and the person was a graduate school student, and when they weren't full-time, we denied it. So I think that would cover it. I don't think you're going to have a proliferation of applicants, without an age limit. Does that make sense, Suki?
Yeah, okay.
any other hands, Jared?
Not seeing any other hands, Mr. Chair.
So then I guess we can move on with the agenda.
We're right on time, Ray. It's 9:57 and we're scheduled to go to discussion items.
Good, let's take a 10-minute break.
Perfect. Thank you, Ray.
Be back at 10:10. Thank you, Jared. We're back in session. We're moving on to discussion items, protected species update.
That would be
Please.
Bob Glenn.
Bob, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everybody. I'll be fairly brief today. Just a couple of updates for the commission on matters pertaining to protected species. My staff and the team at DMF working on the incidental take permit are making excellent progress. We're moving right along. We have a pretty important consultation meeting tomorrow with National Marine Fisheries Service to kind of specify a few key points within our take permit application. But otherwise, we are on track to submit the application by this July. That's our target. And so far, we're on track to do so. That's going pretty well. And another additional item is, as you're aware, last year we had several outreach events whereby we distributed weak rope and other weak contrivances to lobster industry members to help to aid them with complying with the new weak rope rules. Our intent is to do that this year, as well as distribute materials for the new gear marking regulations. We have ordered pretty large volume of those materials, specifically gear marking, things like heat shrink tube, as well as twine and other tape and other supplies that can be used to gear mark. It was our hope to have already started hosting those events already. I understand that it's the time of the year when fishermen are in their gear sheds trying to work on this. Unfortunately, like everything else in society right now, we are running into some supply chain issues. And so the large orders of those materials that we made have been trickling in, and they are more and more is coming in every week. But we're unfortunately, we've had to wait till we get a critical density of that material to host the events. We wouldn't want to host an event and invite a bunch of fishermen and then only have, run out of supplies or only be able to give each fisherman a kind of a real modest amount. So we do have one scheduled for the end of this month in Scituate. That'll be the first one. And then we haven't scheduled the others yet because we're still waiting on some updates from the manufacturers and suppliers. But we're pushing as hard as we can to get those in the hands of fishermen at least in April prior to the start of the season in May. Understanding, really appreciate their patience on that and understand it'd be more ideal if we could get it to them sooner, but we're doing the best we can. And then finally, what I wanted to talk about, Lieutenant Bass touched on this earlier, but this is an excellent program that we initiated this year. It's our trap closure gear removal program. This has been a really excellent collaborative effort amongst DMF and Mass Environmental Police, as well as several commercial fishing industry members. So essentially, the goal of this is to haul abandoned gear in state waters that were left behind in our closed area to protect North Atlantic right whales. And we've been able to use the aerial surveillance from our Center for Coastal Studies flights, as well as Mass Environmental Police vessel patrols to identify and confirm the location of abandoned gear left in the closure. And we were able to receive funding from the governor to contract commercial lobstermen for 25 sea days. And I actually just upped that an additional 10 days, working with our Kevin Creighton, our chief financial officer. During these operations, MEP provided vessel escort for all the contracted lobster vessels while we were out hauling gear. And then we put a DMF staff member on board the 6 commercial lobster vessels when they were out each day to inventory and identify all the gear that is being hauled. And this program's really critical to ensure the success of our right whale conservation program for a couple of reasons. One, it ensures that the closure is effective. We get credit from the National Marine Fisheries Service in the decision support tool that during the closure there is zero risk, and so it's critical that those buoy lines are not there and that they don't pose any risk to whales, because if we were to entangle a risk in a closure, it would put us in a really vicarious situation relative to the success of our lobster fishery and the success of our incidental take permit. And then also it demonstrates to National Marine Fisheries Service and the take reduction team that Mass is enforcing its regulations and we're monitoring compliance on those regulations. Next slide, please. Overall, so far in this program, overall compliance with the closure has been good. From Chatham to Cohasset, I would characterize it as being very good. We find only modest amounts of lost gear. And as Matt Bass mentioned earlier, at least the southern portion of that closed area, they've had it since 2015. And so they're used to it. They're used to getting their gear out on time. And so compliance overall has been great in that. From Boston north to Cape Ann, we definitely need some improvements. We have seen substantial amounts of gear left behind in the closure. In addition, with this hauling program, it gives ourselves and Mass Environmental Police the opportunity to look at the buoy lines for compliance to the new weak rope rules. And again, in this case, I would say compliance with those rules overall has been very good. We're finding most buoy lines that we find that are abandoned do have the appropriate weight, well-safe weak inserts in them, which is excellent. There are, however, again, up in that kind of the Salem Sound and Outer Mass Bay area, in cases where we have found larger amounts of abandoned gear, we've also observed some a fair amount of non-compliance in that region with the 1,700-pound rope rules. And so that's an issue of, of concern that hopefully these enforcement actions and the monitoring and hauling program is a good motivator for fishermen to comply in years to come. Next slide. This is just an overview of the work that we've completed to date. So far, we've done 24 sea days on contracted commercial lobster vessels. We've removed 406 vertical lines and almost 1,600 traps. And that was distributed across a rough estimate of about 129 permit holders, a combination of rec gear and commercial gear. And again, let me stress that the most of that, what we're finding, a large portion of it is grassed up, balled up, or, kind of gear that's been lost as the result of storms. Only the minority or the smaller portion of it has been gear that's clearly, just has been abandoned in place. And that's been the smaller amount of it. And then also we kind of divided up the coast, and the Mass Environmental Police very graciously offered to cover the Cape Cod Bay region because they've been working in that area extensively for the last several years. So through efforts led by Matt Bass using their vessel, the Jessie, they've also completed a bunch of that of days. And these are rough estimates. I reached out to Matt kind of late in the game, and so he gave me pretty solid estimates of that. So far, he's been out about 22 sea days, hauled 77 buoy lines, about 200 traps total. And so, in total, it's been very successful. We've removed a lot of potential risk out to right whales. And so that's been great. We still have a fair amount of gear remaining up around, the Salem Sound and south of Cape Ann, a little bit out in the deeper waters of Mass Bay that we're going to be targeting in the next week and the week after, with the additional 10 sea days that I was able to secure. So we're hopeful that will continue to go well. Next slide. And so a little more about the program. All the gear that we haul is taken back to port, where DMF staff identifies the owners and then notifies them that about their gear. The fate of the gear depends on the nature of what we find. And so in cases where we just find small quantities of gear that's either that's grassed over and lost, or just a random trawl, one or two trawls or traps here and there, and if all of those are compliant with the whale safe measures, we simply just call the fishermen and tell them that they can come pick up their gear. It's just returned to the owner, no issues, no problems. In cases whereby we find pretty broad scale non-compliance, where it's clear that the fisher has left out multiple trawls that are not particularly grassed over, or just large sets of gear, or those gear are not compliant with whale safe measures, all of those cases are referred to the Mass Environmental Police. And in some cases, we've assisted them with seizing some fairly substantial quantities of gear. And MEP is working on multiple pending cases relative to non-compliance with this. They could speak to that at a future point. And next slide. And then finally, I just really wanted to give a special thanks out to the Mass Environmental Police. This has been, again, there's been great support. And as you can see in this picture of, this is off of Cohasset, I believe, with one of our contracted vessels working on a gear ball that we hauled up. And you can see in the background our Mass Environmental Police Escort. They've been, especially Captain Baker, Lieutenant Matt Bass, and Sergeant Rob Aiken have been really great at coordinating these efforts with us and making sure, we have good escorts and advice relative to compliance issues. And, and a whole multitude of MEP officers who assisted with this, many of them, and it's been great. Also, the 6 contracted lobstermen, Fred Penny, Jeff Bartlett, Eric Lorenzen, Dean DeCoste, Mike Rigo, and Kurt Martin, they've been indispensable, and their vessels are, having professional fishermen there to haul and help manage the gear is, hugely important to the success of this operation. And then finally, I'd just like to mention 4 DMF staff who spent a lot of days on the water in cold conditions working on this, especially Julia Kaplan, who has the nickname the lobster trap lady, because she's made so many calls to fishermen to come get their gear. Anna Dorrance, Brendan Riley, and Alex Boeri. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have.
Questions for Bob Glenn?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Ray and Jared. This is kind of off topic a little bit, but maybe Dan can answer. I'm not sure if you can, Bob. What happened to the program the governor was looking to fund some coils of buoy line for federally permitted guys to buy some coils of rope to make up separate buoy lines? I haven't heard anything about that lately.
Dan?
Yeah, I don't know if this was on our to-do list as for this season. I think we've been spending much of our resources on this compliance and gear removal issue. I believe that there's a federal bill that's being expected to be enacted, I think for $14 million shared among states to help fishermen comply with these rules. I got some positive news yesterday that they do expect that to pass, and the money would be distributed to the states in proportion to their number of active federal permit holders. So that's probably where the money would come from, but I can't give you any timeline as to when that would be available to the fleet.
I just thought it was something specific that the governor had mentioned. I'm not sure why. It doesn't seem like an issue now. This is the time for the federal guys to buy the rope and be able to have it, put it in place. I didn't hear anything about next year. I thought it was going to be in this year, so I'm not sure what's taking place now.
Well, I'll keep you posted on that federal money. It might be available sooner than later. It wouldn't be available before May 1st, though. But we're hopeful we can get those funds.
Yeah, I understand what you're talking about. I just saw that bill yesterday, but I would say that's probably a long way away from being funded and implemented, especially at the federal level. I thought it was the governor was doing something on his own, but I guess not.
Yeah, pardon me, Suki, but I got an email from Deke Tompkins at ASMFC. And number 2 reads Senators Jean Shaheen, Susan Collin, and Representative Jared Golden introduced the Safe Seas Act on March 7th. The legislation would provide funds to mitigate costs for lobster and Jonah crab harvesters to comply with the Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction Plan and Addendum 29, I believe.
That would be the trackers, Ray.
Sheen, well, I thought it goes on to say something about gear for lobstermen. It was $14 million. So, but anyways.
Yeah, I saw that. That's a whole different subject what I'm talking about. I just was led to believe the governor was looking to finance some rope, and the only discussion that I had heard was going on about it was they were trying to identify a few different rope manufacturers instead of letting people buy all different kinds of rope. They were going to target some specific, and that's what the was supposedly ongoing, was identifying the majority of who the people would supply the rope would be. But I guess I don't know. I just feel that I thought this was something that was in place, but obviously not. So I'm not sure where to go with it now.
Well, we can look into it, Suki, and get back to you offline.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Suki. Any other questions for Bob Glenn?
Not seeing any other hands raised.
Then we can move along on this agenda. Upcoming public hearings on quota managed species.
So I'll make this really short. Next week, we have a public hearing on Monday and on Wednesday. Monday's public hearing will address menhaden season start date, commercial bluefish minimum size, and a renewed striped bass control date for the commercial endorsement, as well as some housekeeping items. And then Thursday's hearing will take comment on the proposed changes to the commercial summer flounder fishery and the commercial black sea bass fishery, and those housekeeping items. And in advance of the commercial summer flounder fishery public hearing, we did meet with the Fluke trawlers earlier this week, I believe on Tuesday night, and we had a really productive meeting. I'd say, a good portion, maybe 75% of the inshore fleet was there. They provided us with some good feedback. We had a nice discussion on these proposed changes, and I expect they'll either be attending Thursday's hearing or providing written public comment in support of some of what we discussed.
Thank you, Jared. Can we move along, or do you have to answer questions to this?
I got a question from Suki.
Suki, you're
Thank you. Did you send out Zoom stuff for this meeting yet, Jared, for these
The
public
public
hearings to the
hearing
commission?
notice is out and the Zoom information's in there.
Say that again?
I said the public hearing notice went out and the Zoom information's embedded in there. I can forward those two hearing notices along after the meeting to the commission members, so you have them.
Okay, I think I saw that. I just didn't see anything about Zoom. Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Any other questions for Jared?
Not seeing any other questions, Mr. Chair.
Okay, let's move along to the summary of the March 1st Shellfish Advisory Panel meeting.
Ray, I'll take that. We held our second meeting. If the commission recalls, this is a codified panel that is a group that is now established by Chapter 130, Section 1C, with representation of many agencies as well as commercial, recreational interests, as well as researchers, aquaculturists. It's the whole gamut. And we had our second meeting. It was virtual. The first meeting we had was in person. That was before the Omicron spike. This last one was virtual. We covered a lot of DMF updates. Specifically, we talked about the creation of two new subcommittees. One to look at the transfer of municipal aquaculture licenses that is overseen by the town, but the Mass Aquaculture Association about 4 years ago filed a bill which turned out to be fairly controversial. And so we are going to endeavor to do some research into how municipalities allow the transfers of those municipal licenses, and bring a report forward to the Shellfish Advisory Panel. And that way, if if municipalities would like to adopt some of these strategies that they might see in the report, that would be their choice. But it would also take a look at what the Mass Aquaculture Association was trying to accomplish, and describe the consequences, intended and unintended, of whatever those changes would be. We also created a second subcommittee regarding what we call bulk tagging. Every container of shellfish must have a tag attached to it. However, the aquaculture industry is under a lot of pressure during the Vibrio season to get that product in as fast as possible and iced. And so we are looking at ways to accommodate that with maybe tagging just the big container instead of every single bag, because obviously the shellfish farmer has to record the information in real time on the flats, and that can add time unnecessarily in terms of processing the oysters relative to the time limitations that they have before getting into ice. And so it was a good meeting. I'm looking forward to more of them. And I will say that the other thing we've been working on is the Mass Shellfish Officers Association training course. Under Chapter 130, Section 98, the position of constables is established in state law. And one of the things that the statute describes is a certification training program that is to be held at the Mass Maritime Academy. This statute's about 20 years old, maybe older, but a couple of decades old, and it's got some good history. But Mass Maritime has taken less interest in this over time, but more importantly, the COVID situation has kind of made it difficult to bring folks together for what was 2 consecutive weeks of day-long instruction. So what DMF has done is we've taken on the responsibility of managing this as in a virtual course format. So Julia, Jared, bringing these Zoom skills that they have that you see in these meetings, they're bringing that to these training sessions where instead of going for 2 weeks for an 8-hour day, now they're going about 3 weeks for a half day a piece. And it's a really interesting syllabus with a lot of things that constables need to know, and a lot they didn't know they needed to know, but it's a good program that has a lot of influence and guidance from some of the senior members of the Mass Shellfish Officers Association, bringing forth their experience. And it's really been a great job that the staff have done. And actually, we've gotten probably more turnout through this format because historically the program was held at Mass Maritime, which means it was in a discrete location that everybody would have to drive to every day. And as a result, we didn't get great turnout from remote places like Cape Ann. Like to have to drive through Boston every day was a hassle. But now with this remote format, through the Zoom screen, more people can participate, and we've gotten some very good feedback. So, and so that's all I have on that. I'll take any questions.
Questions for the director?
I'm not seeing any questions for the commission, Mr. Chair. Oh, Bill Emery.
Bill, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Jared. Dan, on the portion of your discussion where you mentioned transferability and the need to do some research on the part of a committee that will be appointed to look into the rules and regulations in the local communities that affects the transferability of aquaculture grants. I would like to just say the local communities that take care of their own waters and the ideas behind the transfers that they've developed to keep the grants operational and fair, it means a lot to the local communities. And one of the concerns that I keep hearing along the waterfront when it comes to shellfish and the initiative is the idea that a central governmental backed group of individuals will have power over the local communities when it comes to these kinds of transfers. And they're concerned about losing their ability and their well thought out programs that have been, in our case, in our community, in effect, almost 30 years, made a success out of the program. And we feel is very fair about who enters into the program and how it's handled, being that it's completely local. And we just want to make it clear that we're intent on continuing to have the local control that we're used to when it comes to these grants and their transfers. Not that there's anything wrong with understanding. I think that's a good idea, how the different communities have decided to come to their decisions about transferability. But we hope that it won't mean that there'll be outside interests coming in and trying to manipulate or motivate the communities to change the processes. We can do that within our own context of our commissions and our committees in the local towns.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Bill. And what you're saying is reminiscent of some of the feedback we got about the Mass Shellfish Initiative. And I think there was just this fear that the net result would be less local control. And that certainly wasn't our intent or the intent of anybody who was managing it. I just think that many of the stakeholders saw that as a potential outcome and they were sort of afraid of that. But the bill that I described that was filed 4 years ago actually turned, I believe it turned the word may into shall, which meant one, and I have to study this further, but I believe one of the consequences of that would be maybe the select boards wouldn't have discretion about, like, say, taking the grant out of production. You know what I mean? So that particular proposed bill could have run counter to what you're asking for, is sort of a protection of the municipal oversight. So that's kind of what we're getting at, is we want to take a close look at that and understand what was being sought and describe the consequences, because it became a really hot button issue during that Mass Shellfish Initiative that almost derailed the whole process, which was really unfortunate, because there's a lot that's needed in the area of shellfish, research and management. And, we finally finished with a strategic plan that was constructive and informative, but it probably set us back at least twice as long as it should have in terms of time. Maybe we lost a year, and caused by the sort of the concerns and the outrage that people expressed, that with I believe a misunderstanding of what the objectives were. But I hear you. I mean, believe me, we know, and that's why everything we do on those meetings, we try to be fully transparent, and we don't make any everything's baby steps, because every report will be made public, and I'll make sure that there isn't a misunderstanding or the potential for people believing in conspiracies that we're doing anything except just trying to look at the issue.
Yeah, okay, and I hear you, and I encourage you to be very transparent, because that attitude that you stated earlier in your statement is still quite strong in the community of local fishermen. But so I've made my point and you've heard it. Thank you.
Yep, thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Bill. Any other hands?
Not seeing any other comments, Mr. Chair.
Let's move it along to updates concerning the ASMSC. Nicola?
Yes, Jared, just bringing up the slides. Okay, so the last commission meeting, or there's a couple meetings to cover. The quarterly meeting, the winter meeting was held in January. One of the action items was Lobster Draft Addendum 27, which responds to a reduced settlement in the Georges Bank and Gulf of Maine stocks, and looks at some measures to increase the protection of the spawning stock through either immediate or triggered changes to the gauge sizes, the V-notch definitions, and the reissuance of lost trap tags. And so that document was approved for public comment. However, we're not expecting those hearings to be scheduled until June. And the rationale for that was, the states were interested to assure that they could have in-person hearings for this addendum, as well as to wait for some pending information on stock status and the implications of right whale rules on the fishery. So that'll be something to look for this summer, though, with those public hearings. We've already talked about black sea bass a bit today, so I'll just note that there's another ASMC meeting on March 24th, where all of the states' proposals for recreational fluke and black sea bass need to be approved before the states can implement them. The meeting materials for that meeting should be posted later today. So if you're interested to see what the other states are proposing for the species, you'll be able to find it on the ASMFC website. At the winter meeting, the Dogfish Board also approved to align the northern region trip limit with what is pending for federal waters. That's expected to be the 7,500 pound limit on May 1st. We're having our own state hearing on that next week. Also concurrently, the proposed rule for federal waters to go to that same 7,500 pound limit is open until March 14th, if anyone's interested to submit comment on the federal waters rule as well. On Menhaden, the board continues to work on a draft addendum that could revise the commercial allocations, how the episodic event set aside program is run, as well as the allowance for landings after a state's quota is taken. So that was a pretty lengthy board meeting with a lot of changes, and the board did not get all the way through the draft addendum. So there's still some more work to be done on that. So it's likely that, June, July, there'll be hearings on that draft document as well. Moving on to striped bass on the next slide. The board for striped bass, this was another contentious issue, of course. The board did approve draft amendment 7 for public comment, and there are 12 hearings scheduled. The first one started 2 days ago, but they go through the 29th of March. Our own for Massachusetts is on the 21st. It's a virtual meeting, and if you don't have any of the announcements about these hearings, you can find the information for it on the ASMC website and register to attend the Massachusetts hearing on the 21st. Some of the important decisions that were made in terms of what's included in this draft amendment were to remove a suite of options that would have afforded additional protection to particular strong year classes, the 2015, 2017, and 2018 year classes. Based on the technical committee's analysis, the result was that protecting particular year classes wasn't going to change the rebuilding schedule. And so if the board wanted to do more to rebuild the stock, that reducing fishing mortality would do more than just changing the slot limit, say along the coast, or changing the minimum size in the Chesapeake Bay recreational fishery. So those options were removed. However, at the same time, there was concern that if the board approves this document in May and then gets the stock assessment in August, and it was determined that more rebuilding is necessary for the stock, that new measures couldn't be implemented through another addendum until 2024. So the result was that the board added an option where if the assessment later this year says more rebuilding is needed, the board can, through a board action, implement new measures to reduce fishing mortality in 2023. And so that would be like a board meeting where measures brought forward by the technical committee to reduce F to the level needed to rebuild the stock could be approved by the board just through a board vote without taking an addendum out to public comment, which would be a more lengthy process. And moving on to 2 other meetings, on February 8th, the commission met with the council and approved that harvest control rule addendum that we've referenced earlier today. That was approved for public comment. And we'll be having our Massachusetts hearing on that on April 13th. And you can, again, find the information for that on the ASOC's calendar, and we'll be sending out our own, announcement of it shortly. Dan also attended a Lobster Management Board meeting on February 22nd, where consideration was given to approving the addendum that would require electronic tracking on the federal lobster and Jonah crab fisheries. There was a lot of concern from the public comment period and the advisory panel about how exactly these tracking requirements would be implemented and administered and what the cost would be to the industry. And so the board determined to postpone the release postpone final action on this addendum in order to develop more of those details. So I believe Dan actually has a meeting later today with the plan development team and other state commissioners to talk about the details of the electronic tracking requirements so that they can consider final approval of that document perhaps later this month or next month. Are there any questions about ASMFC actions?
I have one question, Nicholas. So when we're talking about bypassing an addendum, this will all be done at the annual meeting in October because we're getting the assessment back sometime this summer. So that's where we could make other management changes at the annual meeting in October for fishing year 23, right?
For striped bass you're referencing?
Yes.
Yes, so the idea of that additional option that was added was that the board would get the assessment in August and the technical committee would know the results of the assessment at that time, whether we're on track for rebuilding, and if not, bring some options forward to the board, perhaps even at the August meeting, and adopt them in October at the latest so that they could be implemented for next year if needed.
And I would like to credit Mike Armstrong for introducing that motion and his rationale. Thank you. Any other questions for Nicola?
I'm not seeing any other hands raised, Mr. Chair.
I guess we're going to move on to the New England Fishery Management Council updates.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is Melanie. I'll provide a report of the council activities since the commission's January 21st meeting and today, during which time the council had its February meeting, as well provide the April council meeting outlook and update commission members on a few other regional fisheries issues, both before the New England Council and Mid-Atlantic Council. So next slide. February outcomes for skates. There was an amendment, sorry, that's a typo. Amendment 8 was approved, or maybe it is 9. I'm starting to get confused between my amendment numbers. Regardless, it was approved and it was a somewhat deflated and roundabout action from when it began as Amendment 5, which was to consider limited access. It turned into a framework when the council constrained its vision to updating the objectives and revising conditions for federal skate fishing permits. But then in February, the council backed off that, selecting no action for the permitting alternatives, agreeing just to update the FMP objectives. However, at that point, Garfo informed the council that it really should be done through an amendment. So that's how this action has gone back and forth, and the council wound all the way back at the amendment action. So the changes are intended to better reflect current conditions in the fishery, the status of the 7 stocks in the skate complex, particularly that barn door is fully rebuilt, and the focus of skate research. So nothing really earth-shattering in the end with skates. Habitat, the council initiated a framework to develop a habitat area of particular concern, or HAPC, in the southern New England area. This action is mainly driven due to concerns about impacts from offshore development, particularly wind and aquaculture. The designation would be particularly relevant to pending essential fish habitat consultations on the remaining wind projects in the area. It would add a conservation focus during those assessments. Generally, the area represents the southernmost distribution for Atlantic cod, and populations at the limit of their distribution certainly are more vulnerable to climate change. This is something of particular interest regarding groundfish and cod. And certainly Atlantic cod's adaptability to remain productive as a stock is already being challenged. So a designation appears to tick a few boxes related to HAPC standards, namely that they are particularly important, play a particularly important ecological role. They are more sensitive to human-induced environmental degradation and are or will be stressed by development activities. So we'll stay tuned on that, and I'll keep you posted as that proceeds. The surf clam fishery, this is also a habitat issue that was before the council. It is managed by the Mid-Atlantic Council, but recent actions by New England have restricted surf clam access to fishing areas like Rose and Crown in the Great South Channel HMA, or the Habitat Management Area. However, the New England Council did set up a pathway for the industry to coordinate on research that would contribute to the future ability to make access decisions while mitigating habitat impacts as necessary in an HMA. So one research project is being conducted by Coonamessett Farm Foundation, CFF, under an EFP, and it has been underway, but it's yet to lead to any conclusions to be shared with the council. Meanwhile, the industry has been pushing for emergency access. The New England Council moved that the Habitat Committee review the results of the Coonamessett Farm Foundation's clam dredge mapping study once that report has been provided to the council. The committee would review the work to decide upon its utility for managing fishing gear impacts within the Great South Channel HMA. And of course, the assessment could be used to support NOAA Fisheries consideration of additional EFPs or even extension of the existing EFP. So on to groundfish. Cod and haddock research tracks are ongoing. The council, as we mentioned earlier in the meeting, the council has recommended Gulf of Maine cod and haddock measures. I won't go into detail now. And there was a possible reprioritization regarding cod stock structure. The council tasked its groundfish committee with considering whether priorities should be changed to develop a plan for transitioning from the current 2 cod management unit to anywhere from 2 to 5 revised management units. So that'll be under discussion next week. Next slide. In terms of the April outlook, the agenda is still a bit fluid, but looking at the broader 3-meeting outlook, a preview of likely final action items includes habitat, as I spoke earlier on the Southern New England HAPC. It's scheduled for this April council meeting. And if you're particularly interested, I would suggest tuning into some upcoming habitat PDT and committee discussions as they refine the problem statement, the rationale, and the objectives. Including focusing in on particular species and what the spatial boundary alternatives really will be. There are other habitat, groundfish, and scallop management designations in the area, as this map shows to the right, including an inshore juvenile cod habitat area of particular concern, or HAPC, in state waters that was approved way back when with the Omnibus Habitat Amendment 2. Those purple HMAs around Cox's Ledge were proposed in the Habitat Omnibus, but GARFO disapproved those. April, scallops. This will probably lead to approval of the scallop limited access leasing scoping document. The scallop committee meets later this month to provide additional input, and if approved in April, hearings should take place this May, June, and I'll be on the road with council staff running those. So groundfish, there's no final action scheduled, but the council likely will take up discussion of Amendment 23 performance metrics and an SSC report on revising acceptable biological catch, or ABC, control rules for groundfish stocks. Next slide. So I do have a few quick additional updates on Atlantic herring, Atlantic mackerel, and council appointments. Action on mackerel is occurring on 2 fronts, with the Mid-Atlantic scheduled to take final action on rebuilding in June. And of course, the state, along with other New England states, Maine and New Hampshire in particular, pursuing reasonable recreational measures in support of rebuilding. So next slide. The Atlantic herring court case. This was issued, the U.S. District Court Judge Sorokin ruled in favor last Friday, March 4th, in favor of midwater trawl vessels fishing for Atlantic herring. This case centers around the 12+ nautical mile buffer zone that excludes midwater trawl gear from Maine to Connecticut year-round as part of Amendment 8 to the herring FMP. So this chart on the left with the dark gray inshore midwater trawl restricted area, that's mostly 12 nautical miles, except for east of Cape Cod, where it bumps out to about 20 nautical miles. So when the National Marine Fisheries Service announced the final rule this January 21st, an organization of midwater trawl industry members under the name of the Sustainable Fisheries Coalition, sued the federal government, citing that the buffer zone was unjustified for conservation purposes and was arbitrary and capricious. The court agreed and has ordered both parties to submit a status report containing their proposed schedules for supplemental briefing regarding the appropriate remedy within 7 days. So that should be, next week we should be hearing some more information on this. Jared did email out an issue brief on the case, and I'd be happy to go into a little further detail with anyone who is interested, but don't want to necessarily take up the commission's time here. Just two quick further points that as for the remedy, it does remain unclear. The council is yet to hear anything from NIMS or NOAA General Counsel. I would imagine the executive committee will be taking this up, hopefully getting an update from NIMS at its March 25th meeting. And finally, I'll just note that in ruling for the plaintiff, the court did not take a position on whether the buffer zone could be rationalized as an allocation decision in the future with a fuller explanation. They did note that the localized depletion justification for the buffer zone failed to have a real clear definition. It wasn't defined spatially or temporally. So I can get into that again a little bit later if anyone has specific questions. Otherwise, next slide. So for Atlantic mackerel, first, I just want to update the commission on some recent staff analysis that informs the recent debate on untracked distributional shift versus the assessment's conclusion of productivity decline. So Dr. Micah Dean basically looked at the latitudinal distribution of eggs and larvae, and these charts and images to the right are mackerel egg distributions. And he produced a series of figures. It shows basically the take-home point, if you look in the lower right-hand corner, that there has been a change in the central mass of eggs from southern New England historically, that red blob, northward, with more recent central mass shown in blue. The colored lines around those blobs show the 90th percentile of distribution. Jared, I think there was another slide with the larval distribution, if you just click. Yeah. So this is basically showing the same thing, just it has to do with larvae instead of egg distribution. So again, the take home here is that clearly there has been a change in the central mass that has not extended beyond the stock's boundaries. A distributional shift is really determined by both the permanence of the shift in newly occupied areas, with the latter not really appearing to have occurred. So with this understanding, going into the Mid-Atlantic's Mackerel Committee on, when was that, February 14th, much of the discussion really focused on appropriate recreational measures to reduce catch. So input from recent informational webinars held by the Mid-Atlantic suggested use of a bag limit rather than any closure, and pushed for consideration of the relative economic impacts in terms of the scale of reduction required. I think those messages were heard both by the Mid-Atlantic and certainly by the states, but of course the ultimate impact is still yet to be determined. So to help advance the discussion, the committee tasked the council staff, the Mid-Atlantic Council staff, to develop a range of recreational Atlantic mackerel trip limit options. And staff was really given a broad leeway here, both in terms of number of fish, although a range from 10 to 50 was provided as an example, as well as whether separate limits might apply by mode. Another motion was to move any recreational seasonal closure to considered but rejected, but this was postponed until the March committee meeting to allow for a fully informed vote. I think at that time, both the bag limit analysis and more refined understanding of the potential closures impact would be available. Finally, staff was asked to look at compliance gaps towards a potential guidance document on mackerel permitting and reporting requirements. I think one thing that came out at those informational meetings was, that there still is some clarification needed to improve compliance and information coming out of the fishery, particularly, one example was with HMS use of bait and the lack of a bait reporting field on the HMS reports. So that's on the Mid-Atlantic side and that action. But then, as I mentioned earlier, We do have the states, namely Maine, New Hampshire, and Mass, discussing the need for what to do in terms of reducing recreational catch in state waters. There has been some talk amongst the states, and another joint letter is being drafted to be submitted to the MID with a coordinated response that really the primary intent is to highlight or inform the MID that the states do intend to take some action to regulate recreational catch of Atlantic mackerel using trip limits, not looking at closures. So each state, of course, will conduct its own detailed public hearing process. But again, the letter is trying to cover some high-level shared points, that pursuit of a bag limit. There's also the messaging of a lack of support for split modes. Some of that discussion you guys already had earlier today with other species, and also an intent to have any regulations in place by January 2023, which aligns with the MID's rulemaking timeline. So that's it for mackerel. Jared, next slide. Sorry, yeah, okay. So then in terms of council appointments, very briefly, we have 2 at-large seats are open for nomination. One of those is held currently by Dr. Sissenwine, Dr. Michael Sissenwine, shown here in the picture. He's terming out. The other is held, I think it's a Rhode Island seat, who is not terming out. We have 4 candidates that have submitted nomination papers, and that submission deadline is coming up March 15th. So we'll have, as soon as that goes out, certainly we'll let folks know, and we can provide copies of the governor's nomination letter. And that is, I think, my full update, Mr. Chair, but if there are any questions.
Thank you, Melanie. Once again, very comprehensive. Questions for Melanie?
Bill Amaru.
Bill, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Melanie. Yes, very good. I have to say, because I'm usually one of the first to find fault when I think something's out of line, to give kudos when I see something that I didn't expect to see. I'm very happy that the MID has provided us, or maybe it wasn't the MID, but at any rate, whatever organization put together the distribution of the egg larvae mass for mackerel definitively moving to the north. It's a step in the direction that we need to take to manage that species correctly. And I'm very happy to see that that's happened. It's going to lead to a much more comprehensive management strategy down the line. So thank you for that.
Yeah, all kudos go to Micah Dean. He put that together.
Mike Bearnock.
Michael, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Melanie, for your presentation. And just to follow up with what Bill just said, thank you, Melanie. Thank the entire staff for leading the way and putting this together associated with mackerel. This, though, is similar to our black sea bass situation. We're suffering from MRIP numbers that have skewed the data set, that we don't have confidence in the results, and we have to then deal with the outcome consistent with the Magnuson-Stevens Act and have accountability measures to address such. I just throw out there, Melanie, that the fact that you are the liaison from the New England Fishery Management Council to the Mid-Atlantic, that I emphatically, and all of us emphatically ask that the for-hire fleet, as well as the commercial fleet, we want to be part of the process. We want to provide the data and information that's needed in order to manage mackerel or black sea bass or so on. So look at us as allies that will work with the different New England National Marine Fisheries Service or the state equivalents to provide the EVTR data that's needed to do that. Our observations on the water, our catch and release on the water, it can be invaluable. And I know you're aware and completely aware of the lack of George's Bank trawl surveys. And as a result of that lack, we have a different outcome when it comes to cod. But that's just an aside. But there's just so many stories about MRIP and these numbers. or lack of data that impacts us. We want to help. We want to address the process. And we're all here with our hands open, asking and hoping that that can occur. So if there are discussions down there about the for-hire fleet or commercial fleet, and if they need to do more, I mean, commercially, they're far ahead of what we have to provide, or recreationally to help do this, anything that can facilitate that and expedite that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, I hear you, Mike. And I would hope that, you know, it's pretty apparent. I'm stating the obvious that this is not a single FMP or species issue. Your points about trying to incorporate more information from the for-hire fleet and look at how they can contribute not just to effort data. So I know there's a national recreational summit, so I'd hope that would be part of the conversation. We'll have staff down there too engaging in that.
Yeah, I'll be at the summit and they will hear our concerns. Thank you.
Yeah.
Questions for Melanie?
Not seeing any other hands raised, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for your presentation, Melanie. Moving along, other business, commission member comments. I'm gonna go around the table. Khalil.
I'm all set, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Suki.
Yeah, great, thanks. A question for Dan. What's the status? I meant to ask it earlier. What's the status of the letter of authorization for the Ropus project in the closed area?
Dan, you're muted. Dan, you there?
Yep, sorry about that. I muted myself and I couldn't unmute. It's still in process, Suki. So we haven't made a final decision yet.
Okay, I'm just wondering what was going on.
Bill Doyle.
I'm all set, Ray. Thank you.
Thank you. Lou Williams.
Yeah, all set, Ray. Thank you.
Thank you, Lou. Shelley Evanson.
Thanks, Ray. I just wanted to thank Dan and Bob for holding a meeting this week with some of the lobster guys on the vineyard and in Fairhaven. There were some concerns about the Gosnold single trap exemption being lifted for the lobster fleet in that area, and some concerns about that being the only open area right now to fishing. And so I really just want to thank Dan and Bob for taking the time to hear the fishermen's concerns. And I know we don't have a solution yet, but that process was really helpful. So thank you.
Thank you, Shelley. Tim Brady.
Yes, thank you, Ray. I would just like to say thank you to everybody involved, and I know a lot of people listening were involved. That full month of for-hire cod in September is a real big deal to us. We've really, losing cod basically entirely before then, when you just had a couple weeks in the fall, you just couldn't book a charter and say, hey, catch some codfish. But I actually got a few charters back last year that I haven't had in years and years. We had some good, the one cod, if they get a good sized cod, they keep it. And we target some other species, that's good. But, I'm fishing in Cape Cod Bay. I'm tucked in Plymouth in Cape Cod Bay. So it does mean a lot. I just wanted to say thank you for that. And again, to echo what Mike has said, in the for-hire fleet, we are basically treated as a commercial fishery, a type of commercial fishery now, but we want to be part of the management solution process. And, we have something in place. I don't know what needs to be changed in the vessel trip reporting that we do, but to hear that our vessel trip reporting is only used for effort is it's just really frustrating. And then to hear that MRIP data on the other, the two sides of the same equation is just suspect. It's just super frustrating. So anyway, to echo what Mike said, we want to be part of the solution. I hope at each level here in Massachusetts, and then the regional councils as well, that there does come a push to involve the for-hire fleet as the start of the piece of the recreational fleet to really be part of the science. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Bill Amaru?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the Division of Marine Fisheries for reaching out to the Fluke industry at the meeting last night. I'm sorry I wasn't able to make it. I'm laid up at the moment. But the thing I want to mention is this is a fishery now that's compact enough that it can literally be a completely democratic process, which it's shaping up to be, where almost every vessel has an opportunity to express itself for how it would like to be managed. The resource is being taken care of. Access is being provided to the fishermen and their voices are being heard. I want to congratulate the fishermen who came to the meeting. As Jared said earlier, it was a very well-attended meeting and it ended up being very productive. So thanks to all of those people involved in that style of management. Let's hope that we can go forward and spread that around to the other fisheries as well.
Thank you, Bill. Mike Pierdnock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank Dan McKiernan and his entire staff. There's been a lot going on, a lot of work in many different fronts. And thank you for that effort. I would just like to add, to expand upon what Tim Brady just said, not only the for-hire fleet commercially, as well as recreationally, there are those that want to help, want to be part of the process and want to make this work. So as we all know, the difficulty is how is that done to make it work, but hopefully we can see some progress to make that go down the right road and not be discussing this 10, 20 years from now, because it's been going on for a long time. Hopefully we'll see an end point to this and it'll be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And I'll close out. Once again, I want to commend commission members for their attendance record. But secondly, after speaking to Director Dan McKiernan and his staff, I would need consensus from commission members. I would like to move these commission meetings to a Tuesday. There just seems to be a conflict. I know I've gotten phone calls in regard to Melanie's reporting out on the New England Fishery Management Council, how comprehensive she is with her reports. And quite often there's conflict. She's at a committee meeting likewise with another commission member who was newly appointed to the council. So if it's, I was told as chair, I could move the date. Dan doesn't have an issue with it. The staff doesn't. And after conferring with his staff, Tuesday would be the better day of the week to have our commission meetings in the future. April 7th being still a Thursday. But then possibly by June and forthwith from June on, we'd be meeting on a Tuesday every month as opposed to a Thursday. So if I can get some feedback on that quickly, is anybody opposed to that? Jared,
I'm not
any
seeing any hands raised to comment in opposition.
Then therefore,
Tim Brady.
Tim Brady, you recognize.
Yeah, just to throw in, Ray, I do have a day job and I do work on Tuesdays now, but I wouldn't want to, I mean, if there's a consensus from the rest of the board, I could work around, you know, with enough notice. I'll do what I can. You know, I teach at Mass Maritime. I just have classes those mornings, but if April is still in Thursday, then that's fine. And then, you know, for May and June, I can probably do my best to get some coverage for that. So
that would be appreciated, Tim. As I said, the April meeting's still going to be on a Thursday.
Yeah.
But thereafter, and right now, there may not be a May meeting because of the scheduling of public hearings and whatnot.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking more starting in June, at which time quite possibly we'll have an in-person meeting also. So yeah. I would, other than you, Tim, I'm not hearing negativity from any other commission members. It just, I think, and I know, and I've been told by other commission members, Melanie's input, her comprehensive attitude about the council, the way she can answer questions. Plus, we've got another council member who sits on the commission, and they both have committee meetings, usually on Wednesday and Thursday. So Tuesday would have been, or is, the best available date to move these commission meetings to. So if you could work around that, Tim, that would be greatly appreciated. And as I said, it won't start until at least June.
Right, right. And I finished teaching in June, and then I could plan for the, the fall, the summer and the fall.
Great, thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to public comment. Gary?
Former Director Phil Coates, you're recognized.
Phil Coates. Long time I haven't heard from you. You're recognized, Phil.
Can you hear me?
I can,
Yes.
Phil.
Good, good. Yes, a long time no talk, partly due to my own incompetence with the.
Phil,
computer.
I'm sorry to interrupt. You're a little muffled. You might want to get closer to the microphone you're using.
Yeah, I'll just see if I can increase the. Take a second, hopefully. Yep, never mind. All right, let me try it. I'll bring it closer. Is that better?
Can you speak again, Phil?
He's still quite muffled.
You're muted now.
How's that?
Still quite muffled.
Yeah, I'm trying to raise the volume and it doesn't want to do that. Let me just, how's that? Is that any better?
That is much better.
All right, I got a crappy speaker. All right, well, I'll be quick. Sorry about that. Couple of things. I'm glad to see the division finally moving forward on the issue of striped bass effort control as manifested by the numbers of permits and everything. We submitted a petition over 2 years ago to address a management proposal similar to what was implemented for Tautog. So I'm glad to see that the control date is now going to be addressed, although I hope there's been an evaluation of the previous, the 2012 control date and the numbers of permits and effort against the possible impacts of the latest control date, fully recognizing that the main meat of any of these actions is the fishing activity and other things that control the ultimate level of effort. Secondly, there's many of you are aware of it. The issue of wastewater management is a giant, major problem, particularly on areas like Cape Cod. It's going to override a lot of stuff, and it's going to be something that engulfs the division. It does now with regard to shellfish activities, but just the blob issue up in Cape Cod Bay is just a small indication of what could happen with regard to some rational controls over what's going on with wastewater management. It's a major topic. We don't have to discuss it anymore now. Lastly, a little bit of an anecdote. Way back when I started working in 1979, the whole Department of Natural Resources was on one floor, including the Division of Law Enforcement. And a gentleman named Will Collier, who was a crusty old boat guy, he ran the boats and did other things, always had good things to say about stuff. And I can remember we were all convened, yakking away about some issue, and he walked in and looked things over and said, "Hey, you guys, you're trying to grow hair on eggs." And moving forward now, I have been watching this actions and the deliberations of the commission, the excellent performances of the staff, and the knowledge and everything being imparted, the complexity of things. And I got to admit, I don't see much hair on eggs. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. You might want to submit your comments by email also, because you were still quite muffled, but. Any other hands from the public, Jared?
Beth Cassoni.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Beth, you're recognized.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
I just wanted to say thank you to the DMF for all their efforts in getting this extra gear marking supplies and weak rope out to the industry. And we have a date set for March 24th at the MLA, but I know they're working on getting a date for the North Shore. We're getting quite a few calls about when that would be. So the sooner the better we can get that on the calendar. I know the industry is anxious at getting their gear compliant because they're paying attention to what's going on in the water. And I'd like to thank law enforcement and the commercial lobstermen who have been out there removing the lost or left gear, will you? I do have some concern about what is happening down in the Cape Cod Bay area Pilgrim Nuclear Power Plant. We've submitted comments to the various entities about Pilgrim's intention on releasing 1 million gallons of radioactive water. And I would hope that the Division of Marine Fisheries would weigh in on that also. You know, we're concerned that it's a sensitive habitat, will you, for our protected species that frequent our waters right now. And, you know, we don't want to see anything happen to them somehow, some way. The lobstermen will probably get blamed for that too. But I just wanted to really say thank you to the DMF staff for all their efforts and also law enforcement. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Beth. And I see you next year. You'll be holding the MLA annual meeting once again.
We are planning on it. That is correct. 23 will be our year. And let's hope that everything stays on the trend down. I heard the numbers are under 100 cases in Massachusetts right now. So 23 will be quite the year for everyone to get back together.
And as in the past, DMF staff will be invited to that along with commission members.
You got it. We'll send out an invitation later this year. We'll put up everything on our website and we will send out our emails and then put it in our newsletter. We are looking forward to it, right?
Thank you, Beth.
Thank you.
Public comment, Jared?
That is it, Mr. Chair. Oh, hold on. Beth, you have your hand back up? No, that is it.
Okay, so we're done with public comment. I need a motion to adjourn. Somebody please make
Move
the
to
motion.
adjourn. Khalil here.
I'll second.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right,
We are adjourned.
meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good day.